Oh, oh, it's running away.
Get back over here. God, I love this game.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Dude, imagine if they added PvP to Monster Hunter. That would be so cool.
Yeah, they already did actually. It was in DOS. You would raise a captured monster and put it in an arena against another monster.
Wait, so why didn't they bring it back?
Dude, I don't know. DOS. They didn't bring back a lot of things from Monster Hunter 2.
Man, DOS is sounding a lot better than newer games. So, like, was it the best in the series?
2 isn't the best in the series.
I thought you said it was your favorite.
No, Try is my favorite. I think you got me confused. On a purely nostalgia level, Monster Hunter Try is my favorite in the franchise, but if I were to judge them based on which one I enjoy the most, I guess it would be 4? In a lot of ways, Monster Hunter 4 is the best game in the series, I believe. Monster Hunter 2 DOS is just the best Monster Hunter game.
So, is it 4 or is it 2? Which one's the best?
Monster Hunter 4 is the best game, but Monster Hunter 2 is the best Monster Hunter game. Monster Hunter 2 DOS is like the last true Monster Hunter game. Everything made after it has just been it's been like a glorified repeat of Monster Hunter Portable.
Dude, what the f are you talking about?
I don't know. Monster Hunter is a product. It was created to make money. Monster Hunter is also a video game, and video games are art. Special kind of art that allows an individual to interact and connect with the art piece directly, to become one with it in a way. A video game is also simply just a game. It's a self-contained world with its own rules, a place separate from reality where the individual, the player, can be both challenged and entertained. The individual can partake in this game with friends, and together they can experience this art together. Monster Hunter is art, a game, and also a product. In order for this product to sell, sacrifices may be made to the art. The game must be updated if it is status quo among competitors, to surpass the competitors. Bottom line, Monster Hunter needs to sell. Now I have a strange analogy that it'll go on for a bit here because I have a lot that I wrote here, but it'll make sense. Imagine Capcom didn't make video games, and instead they made, I don't know, ice cream. This analogy does go somewhere, I promise. Just imagine for a minute that their games were ice cream instead of video games. In this analogy, Capcom is known for their chocolate ice cream. Their chocolate ice cream is popular and sells well. It's always sold well. They have different variations of this chocolate ice cream, and every variation has seemed to have at least some success. In 2004, Capcom experimented and released a mint chocolate chip ice cream. It had a unique mint taste that left consumers with a mixed reception. However, the chocolate chips used in the recipe was still the classic Capcom chocolate that was already immensely popular. Ultimately, this new ice cream flavor had success, but it was nothing compared to their older chocolate flavors. In 2005, a team led by Ichinose-san created a variant of this mint chocolate ice cream as a treat that can be consumed individually on the go. This version of the treat did better sales-wise compared to the tub of the mint chocolate ice cream. In 2006, Capcom revised their mint chocolate ice cream flavor. They decided to try and improve the mint taste. However, Ichinose's variant was still doing better in sales. In 2007, Ichinose's team decided to add more chocolate to their frozen treat. And what do you know, sales began to skyrocket. In 2009, Capcom decided it would be best practice to update the ice cream tub version of the mint chocolate chip to also have more chocolate. At this point, improving the mint taste became a lower priority. As years went on, Ichinose added more chocolate to the recipe, and the sales continued to remain high. Consumers tended to like this version more, and more chocolate kept being added. In 2018, Capcom announced a brand new recipe for the original mint chocolate chip ice cream. This new recipe promised a refined and brand new experience. In 2018, I opened that tub of ice cream, and I was very excited. But it wasn't mint chocolate chip anymore. It was chocolate with mint pieces. Was it good? Yeah, absolutely. Was it what I wanted? Well, frankly, no. I'm using this ice cream analogy to help illustrate the bias that some veteran players have when they frankly talk shit about the newer Monster Hunter games. Unfortunately for them, the truth is, most people like chocolate more. That's why you find chocolate everywhere. Not everyone likes mint. That's why you don't find mint in everything a chocolate. The original mint was too strong for most players. When they announced extra chocolate, more players were brought on board. When they announced it would be mostly chocolate, they had record-breaking sales. Monster Hunter World is, I think, Capcom's best-selling game. And of course it would be because the chocolate is fantastic. But the chocolate is not why I bought the game. I bought it for the mint. I always bought it for the mint. So what's the story behind the mint? Where did it go? This video aims to prove that Monster Hunter 2 DOS was the last mint-focused Monster Hunter. In other words, the last true Monster Hunter game. The last attempt to create a survival simulator action multiplayer game. I am considering this something of a merged retrospective / review / video essay. I'll be dissecting the particulars about Monster Hunter 2 DOS that sets it apart from the other titles in the Monster Hunter franchise. I'll also be using the game to support my thesis, if I may call it that, on the game direction this series has nosedived in since Monster Hunter 2 DOS. Though, overall, I'll be mostly comparing Monster Hunter 2 DOS to Monster Hunter World, Iceborne, and Rise. This will be a long video, so the too long didn't read version is basically this. Monster Hunter as a series has switched focus away from being a survival simulator action multiplayer game. Monster Hunter as a series has done so by streamlining the gameplay loop to focus on DPS boss fights and the overall player base meta. Many gameplay features have been streamlined into being effortless or outright removed, dubbed quality of life changes by the community, and brushed off. Monster Hunter has thus lost elements of the gameplay loop that one could consider valuable to its original genre. Monster Hunter 2 DOS is the antithesis to the current 5th generation Monster Hunter titles and is the last true Monster Hunter game. And finally, every Monster Hunter title since Monster Hunter Portable 2nd have actually been Monster Hunter Portable games, not Monster Hunter games. And I'll get into that point in way more detail very soon, because I know that's a little bit crazy to say. The point of this video is to highlight the unique but flawed experience Capcom crafted for Monster Hunter 2 DOS. Capcom's struggle to improve that experience, and how Capcom settled on just adding more chocolate. So sit back and enjoy this very long ride.
Did I just evade through the roar? What the heck?
My intention with this video is to be as objective as possible, but you'll notice in my thesis I wrote, "One could consider valuable," which is inherently a subjective statement. I'll be clear as possible when my points are subjective, and when they are, they're just to provide perspective. Everyone who plays a video game is going to have a different experience and may or may not enjoy that experience. I am not ignorant to the fact that many people prefer the newer Monster Hunter titles to the old. I am the same. Don't get me wrong. Subjectively, the original Monster Hunter 1 was rough to play. From my experience online, a majority of the community seems to share this opinion. However, those who have played the original titles when they were first released are very fond of the unique experience that the older titles provided. This video is to shed light on the unique gameplay features that are missing in current titles, as well as to provide a voice for the minority that desires a proper return to form for the franchise. For example, too many times when I've witnessed veteran fans defend the older titles, the retort from a newer fan is typically along the lines of, "The games weren't as fun," or, "It wasn't fun back when you had to do blank."
Gathering quests. Now, if you're new and you've only played Monster Hunter World, you probably don't even know that these existed, and that's for the better, trust me. Old games had these gathering quests, and sometimes they were actually required in order to progress. deliver 20 unique mushrooms. So you're running around a massively huge map, collecting mushrooms, waiting for a random rare drop of a unique mushroom. You have to do this 20 times, go all the way back to camp and deliver it. It's not fun at all.
Fun is a subjective value. It's meaningless in objective discussion. Also, that exact quest is also in World, so I don't know what he's talking about.
I don't mind if it's there as an option because it helps you learn the maps and you might get some rewards.
Yes, that's why they put those in the game.
So then you get into situations like this, which is super annoying, where you're trying to mine an area for items, but you have to swap or discard stuff, and you're getting attacked by small monsters all at the same time. Not a fun time.
Actually, you're just not playing the game correctly.
If we go over to Monster Hunter World, it's awesome. You can see where all the mining spots are. Just go up and you can just press a button and it's almost instantaneous. Again, there was no challenge or strategy in bringing items and managing your item pouch just to collect stuff.
What are you talking about? There is strategy. There is strategy. What? And for those who have tried to defend the older titles, I commend you. However, this discussion is vast and complex, and simply saying it was better back then, or it had a better feeling back then, just isn't good enough. Nor is saying it's more immersive. Asking for a simulator game to be more immersive is a valid request, absolutely. However, the retort will always be that Monster Hunter World is also just as immersive. The same could be said for having more charm. People always say the old games have more charm. I would say Monster Hunter World equally has charm to it. It's just you're not used to it. I'm exploring these hypothetical straw man arguments to stir conversation intentionally. I want those listening to digest this information and keep the discussion strong. This is an ongoing conversation. Bottom line, old or original does not equal better, nor does new or current equal better. Neither is better. Going forward, I want to preface that I'm not a game designer. I will attempt to discuss game design for these games entirely from a player perspective, so if I make a mistake, please feel free to let me know. Furthermore, because I'll be comparing the likes of Monster Hunter 2 DOS from 2006 to Monster Hunter 5 World from 2018, there will obviously be aspects of the older title that will feel archaic to the newer title. I want to be very clear that the archaic game design does not automatically equate to bad game design. Monster Hunter, like every video game series, experiments with its design every title and tends to settle on aspects and features that smoothen the gameplay loop and pleases the overall player base. In other words, to ensure it actually sells. Monster Hunter 2 DOS is very different from World or Rise and asks the player to play the game very differently. This, again, does not equate bad game design. The game philosophy is just different. For this video, when I refer to game philosophy, I refer to the individual decisions the developers took to create a gameplay loop. I want to stress that this video is not claiming that any specific Monster Hunter title has a better design philosophy than the others. Rather, this video is to highlight the qualities of Monster Hunter 2 DOS's design philosophy that are absent in subsequent titles. I'll be comparing this to Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise's design philosophy and discussing where the current Monster Hunter design philosophy came from over the last decade. From my ice cream analogy, it should be clear, Monster Hunter portable games are responsible for the destruction of Monster Hunter games. I actually still see players in the community confused over whether or not Monster Hunter Rise is considered a portable game, despite it being made by Ichinose's team. Personally, I believe that anyone with actual experience with the other portable titles should be able to immediately recognize this game as a portable entry from an aesthetic standpoint and also clearly from the deliberately simple narrative the game presents, especially when you compare these to Monster Hunter World. Capcom has gone out of their way to ditch the old nomenclature of the series in order to not alienate potential new buyers. The title Monster Hunter World sounds like a game that's easier to get into compared to the title Monster Hunter 5. Newcomers aren't necessarily always aware that each Monster Hunter game is actually a completely standalone experience, and does not require the player to play the previous entries in order to understand this current release. The numbers on the box apparently tend to scare consumers. Capcom has even gone out of their way to claim that Monster Hunter Rise is the next mainline installment in the franchise. In other words, a Monster Hunter 6, despite their internal planning documents listing the actual Monster Hunter 6 to be released sometime in 2023 or 2024. I understand why they're doing this. Capcom wants to push Monster Hunter Rise as a new entry, not some kind of weird Nintendo Switch spin-off. And this is why the game isn't called Monster Hunter Portable 5th. The portable title was dropped for Monster Hunter Cross and will likely never return. Despite the title being gone, I strongly believe that Monster Hunter Portable's philosophy and design has directly impacted the non-portable games. Despite this title being gone, I strongly believe that Monster Hunter Portable's philosophy and design has directly impacted the non-portable games. Impacted them enough to where I truly believe that every game has actually been a Monster Hunter Portable game, regardless of whether or not Ichinose's team has worked on it. Throughout this video, I will refer to both Monster Hunter and Monster Hunter Portable, and I need to define what I'm implying when I mention these terms moving forward. I am not referring to the literal physical games known as Monster Hunter and Monster Hunter Portable. I am referring to the specific, unique video game genres that are attached to these two games. I am using these terms as quantifiers or placeholder titles. The definition of Monster Hunter Portable does not represent a Monster Hunter title on a portable console, nor does it represent a port of a Monster Hunter to another console. My definition of Monster Hunter Portable also does not represent a game developed by Ichinose or the Portable team, which, for those who don't know, refer to the developers at Capcom that created Monster Hunter Portable, Portable 2nd, 2nd G, Portable 3rd, Cross, Double Cross, and Rise. So, to clarify, I am considering the titles Monster Hunter and Monster Hunter 2 DOS as Monster Hunter games. I'm considering the titles Monster Hunter 3G, 4, 4G, World, Iceborne, as well as Monster Hunter Portable, Portable 2nd, 2nd G, Portable 3rd, Cross, Double Cross, and Rise as Monster Hunter Portable games. I deliberately left out Monster Hunter 3, the original, for the Wii. It's because I can't decide if I consider it a Monster Hunter game or a Monster Hunter Portable game. By my definition, that's something that's, I think, up to debate because it has a little bit of both. When I refer to Monster Hunter Portable, I'm referring to a game that has a different genre from Monster Hunter. This genre is difficult to describe and is essentially evolved into what we consider the hunting game genre. There are other franchises that have games I consider holding this genre, such as Dauntless, God Eater, or Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. A Monster Hunter game is not better than a Monster Hunter Portable game. Let me be clear there. They are separate entities and experiences. It is difficult to rank these against one another on objective quality. Now, Monster Hunter and Monster Hunter Portable games appear to be structured the same on surface level. In both genres, the player partakes in a quest loop system. This quest loop system can be described as completing specific tasks within an environment, which then provides the player with reward items that can be used to ultimately improve the player character's stats. Improving the player character's stats allows the player to complete more difficult tasks in these environments. The cycle repeats until the player has completed every task or every quest. Monster Hunter Portable is a game bearing the Monster Hunter title and subject matter. However, it differentiates itself from Monster Hunter games by focusing solely on the more difficult quests, usually the ones against boss monsters. The game challenges the player to face different boss monsters one after another, each one proving to be more difficult than the last. This gameplay loop has been described as the core gameplay loop of Monster Hunter. This is considered the grind by the community. This video aims to prove that the actual core gameplay loop of Monster Hunter was lost, and that the current core gameplay loop of Monster Hunter is actually the core gameplay loop of Monster Hunter Portable. The grind, as it is known today, did not exist in Monster Hunter 1 or 2, not in the same way. I define the grind as repeating the same activity over and over again. This repetition is required in order to acquire the RNG drops and increase the player rank. Monster Hunter 1 and 2 did not require a grind for increasing rank, and the game actively prevented the player from easily repeating the same activity over and over again. Evidence for this will be expanded throughout the video. Monster Hunter 2 DOS is the main focus of this video because it represents, celebrates, and expands the original core gameplay loop of Monster Hunter, before Monster Hunter Portable 2nd boiled down the gameplay loop into a string of boss fights and grinding. Instead, Monster Hunter 2 DOS is a survival hunting and gathering village simulation game, and the last truly survival and simulator focused title in the series. In part 1 of this video, I will need to introduce the game, its history, and its significance in the franchise at time of release. But I'll also explain my relative history with it, and I'll outline the game's controls to provide context for later segments. In parts 2 to 8, I'll outline specific gameplay elements such as the quest system, day and night and season cycles, the concept of deliberate action, the lack of a farm, etc. All of these are critically important to my thesis on this game and the Monster Hunter franchise as a whole. If at any point you wish to pause the video, timestamps will be in the comments and description for you to return if you take a break. Ultimately, I'm hoping this video will generate a discussion in the community. I'd like for the older philosophies and features to be highlighted and appreciated, and push for a Monster Hunter title that focuses on the original, the actual core gameplay loop of Monster Hunter. Though I am aware that the Western players will never hold the same influence on the developers as the Japanese players do. Okay, we're almost there. I just have 2 more quick notes I gotta say before I begin. 1. My budget is tight, and I do not prioritize purchasing better hardware for gaming. I am completely content with Monster Hunter World running on the absolute lowest possible settings. In fact, I've joked about this before, I'm actually running Monster Hunter World on a Macintosh computer. Everyone told me it wasn't possible, but I proved them wrong. Eventually, I will have to upgrade and get a better computer, because I do want to get Rise on the PC, but for now, I'm content with what I have. And besides, the graphical settings of the game are largely inconsequential to the points made in this video, and they're not critical to my discussion here. And number 2, I'm not a pro at Monster Hunter, so if I don't perfectly iframe every single attack in the gameplay footage, I'm sorry. I'll do my best to get better. It's gonna take me a few more 1,000 hours of playing before I can get to, the point of a speedrunner. And even then, that's not my goal. I take my time with the games. That being said, player skill doesn't get brought up much in this video, and it's largely not critical to this discussion. Alright, that's everything. Let's begin. Monster Hunter 2 DOS was only released in Japan. It's impossible to play this game in English legally, unfortunately. I respect Capcom, and I love this franchise that they have created, so it's unfortunate that I must illegally patch this game in order to play it comfortably. Monster Hunter is a series that has always required basic reading ability to properly play. I'm sure many others struggled with Monster Hunter Portable 3rd on the PSP because it too was only released in Japan. I own nearly every Monster Hunter game. I've even bought World and Iceborne twice, first on the PlayStation 4 and then on PC. Well, my Mac. I'm saying all this to show that again, I respect Capcom and I wish for them to succeed as a company. I've given them a lot of money. I ask for an allowance on just this game, just this once, because I want to experience this game, and I want to experience it properly and understand what I'm selecting in these menus. In the gameplay footage that I'll present in the video, I'll be using an English patch for the game, though the patch is incomplete and the NPC dialogue remains untranslated. I am technically missing out on the game's truest, purest experience, but it is understandable that this wasn't translated because this was a freelance translation job, and I don't blame the guy. Now for a proper introduction. Monster Hunter 2 DOS is the follow-up home console title to Monster Hunter G, and it actually contains all the monster and equipment content from Monster Hunter G. It also grabbed the new content from Monster Hunter Portable as well, such as Yan Garuga and the Kirin armor. Essentially, it could be viewed as an expansion to Monster Hunter G. Of course, there were changes to the game's general flow, and the hunting locales were different, and there were brand new monsters, and the village and town were both brand new locations as well. But the game didn't get a new engine, or changes to the control scheme. It was just more content compared to the last game, with almost all the pre-existing content still included. In fact, even the old village from Monster Hunter 1 is unlocked at the end of the offline story. I'm making a big point out of this because after Generation 2, this doesn't happen again. For example, Monster Hunter 3 does not expand on 2. It's a whole new game with a new engine. Most of the content from Monster Hunter 2 DOS was cut for 3. Monster Hunter 4 does not expand on 3. The game was radically different, and again much of the content from 3 was cut. Monster Hunter 5 World did this again. Obviously Capcom does this because they want every entry to be fresh, and they want to highlight the new content rather than repeat the old, which is absolutely fine. Though, Generation 2 stands as an anomaly because it's the only generation where nearly nothing was cut. Everything was just expanded. As for my personal history with Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the game was always very mysterious. It was difficult to find gameplay footage of the game on YouTube back in 2009 when I got into Monster Hunter. There's still not a lot of footage on there today. I played Monster Hunter 3 Tri first, that was my first game. When I would research how to play Monster Hunter 3, I discovered that there was a huge amount of Monster Hunter content that seemed to be missing in Monster Hunter 3, the content from Generations 1 and 2. This content intrigued me. I played Monster Hunter Portable 2nd G to get the content that I was looking for, because Monster Hunter 2 DOS was never localized. However, having now played Monster Hunter 2 DOS, I realized that it is a very different game compared to Portable 2nd G. Do not let anyone fool you into believing they are the same experience. They are not. Interesting to note, Monster Hunter 2 DOS was developed in less than 2 years' time. Monster Hunter 1 was released March 11, 2004. Monster Hunter G, the expansion, was released less than a year later in January 20th, 2005. And then Monster Hunter 2 DOS was released February 16th, 2006. With such an extreme turnaround, it's not surprising that the game's engine was not really refined. The game's controls remained exactly the same, and the overall quality stayed equivalent to the previous entries. The overall experience of Monster Hunter 2 DOS is actually closer to Monster Hunter 1's overall experience. That's why I said at the beginning I consider them both true Monster Hunter games. This video is primarily about Monster Hunter 2 DOS. However, many qualities of this game also apply to Monster Hunter 1. While I will outline all of the new features Monster Hunter 2 DOS introduced, I will also mention features that are actually present within both games. I find that it is common to hear sour opinions on Monster Hunter 1. The original GameSpot review of Monster Hunter 1 is quite harsh, calling it archaic even in 2004. Both Monster Hunter G and Monster Hunter 2 DOS did very little to improve the archaic design, which is consensually agreed upon by most people who've played Monster Hunter 1. The controls for Monster Hunter 2 DOS are the same as they were in Monster Hunter 1. Attacks are dealt through the use of the right analog stick. It's a bit unorthodox. The only other time I've seen this in an action game was in Metal Gear Solid 2's Sword segment. It was okay in that game because the player didn't need control of the camera. That game was designed for fixed camera placements. It's cumbersome in Monster Hunter because the game is in a completely open 3-dimensional map where control of the camera is essential to play efficiently. In Monster Hunter 1, the monsters were more sluggish, so there was some leg room. But the new monsters introduced in Monster Hunter 2 DOS move and turn more efficiently. Being on top of the camera is really important to play well. Thankfully, pressing the L1 button will spin the camera to be facing forward. And the directional buttons give all the other camera movement a player may ask for. You see, on a PlayStation controller, it's not so bad. The infamous claw trick was to use your index finger to hit the directional buttons while your thumb was used for movement. We had to do this on the PSP as well. It takes some time getting used to it, but it's not impossible. However, if you try this out with a controller that has the left stick and directional buttons switch places compared to a PlayStation controller, for example, an Xbox or Nintendo controller, you will have some awful trouble using your index to manipulate a joystick while your thumb presses directional buttons. I usually end up putting my whole hand on the thing. I would not recommend using a controller with a placement like this. On the note of Nintendo controllers, I also do not recommend using a GameCube controller. I had a friend try it and it just doesn't work. There are some other strange button differences in Monster Hunter 2 DOS compared to the modern games. The triangle button pulls up the chat. L2 is for cycling through items. R2 is for dashing, which is separate from R1, which is exclusively for special attack. I've read in forums from when Monster Hunter Portable was released, and discovered that some players were upset that R1 was no longer dedicated to one action, but now both, claiming it's easier to guard this way. The separation of R1 and R2 as separate actions returned with Monster Hunter World. Personally, I prefer when they are combined, but it is up to player preference. The circle button is used for accepting in menus, and X is used to cancel, which was standard in Japanese games. Actually, if you try to play Monster Hunter 1, you'll notice that they switch the roles of O and X so that it's consistent with American games. O is now cancel, and X is accept. But they swap the functions for these buttons as well, so X is for carving and gathering, while O is for evading. The controls are very strange. Even though Monster Hunter 2 DOS was released after Monster Hunter Portable, the developers chose not to use Monster Hunter Portable's control scheme. They probably believed the old control scheme was superior, or they wanted to keep it consistent. I also theorized that it might have been intentional, like they wanted the player to have difficulty. Either way, this is an incredibly cumbersome control scheme that takes many hours to master, especially if the player is already familiar with the more modern controls present in the newer titles. Monster Hunter 1 was built around online play first and foremost. This is evident by both the marketing and known development history of the title. I believe the single-player mode was designed as a bonus, and for players who did not have internet access. Once the player goes online, they'll find the overall experience of the game more manageable. The cumbersome controls and camera aren't so bad when the monsters are switching their target to other players. Monster Hunter 1's story is essentially non-existent because of this. The focus was on online multiplayer experience, and most of the content is only available via the online servers. Because of this, I find Monster Hunter 1 to be unplayable. Most of the content, the good content, could only be accessed by playing online, and since the online servers have been shut down, you can no longer access them. As a single-player only game now, it's an incomplete experience. I don't think that anyone would disagree if I said that Monster Hunter Portable is a better experience than the original Monster Hunter 1 is now. You don't need to play Monster Hunter 1 because Monster Hunter Portable is the same game with improvements. It had all the extra monster and equipment content from Monster Hunter G. It uses the modern control scheme, the feline kitchen, a new farm system, and none of the content is locked behind any sort of online server. All of these improvements in Portable were repeated in Monster Hunter Portable 2nd and 2nd G, so the same statement is posed. You don't need to play Monster Hunter 2 DOS, because Monster Hunter Portable 2nd G is the same game with improvements. Though I'm sure there are a few who may agree, I would call this statement completely false. Monster Hunter 2 DOS made me realize that many of the improvements found in the Portable games directly impacted the definition of old-school Monster Hunter gameplay. The Portable game's core gameplay loop was vastly different. The game was redefined. Every single Monster Hunter title since Portable 2nd G has been built on this redefined gameplay loop, the Monster Hunter Portable philosophy. Monster Hunter 2 DOS decided not to improve its predecessor's shortcomings, and instead the game embraced them. While the developers did improve the offline single-player experience immensely, they did not improve any of the overall game's archaic design. The offline experience for both Monster Hunter 1 and Monster Hunter 2 DOS is extremely difficult, though Monster Hunter 2 DOS offers new features that expand on that harsh difficulty, not to make it more or less difficult, but rather to add more nuance to the mechanics. I'll cover these changes in great detail throughout this video. This video exists because I want to highlight the unique changes Monster Hunter 2 DOS made in order to forge a new video game genre. All these unique changes were abandoned over the last decade, as Monster Hunter has shifted into a different direction, a separate new video game genre. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the basic gameplay loop of village quest is still here. However, the choice in which quests can be chosen and how the player manages their time in this game is very different. It's built around unique systems that were never brought back for future titles. I'll use this to elaborate on the concept of deliberate action and break down the original intention behind certain gameplay features that continue to remain in current Monster Hunter titles to this day. I believe many players playing Monster Hunter 2 DOS for the first time without any knowledge of its differences will expect it to play like Monster Hunter Portable 2nd G. In simplest terms, the player has a home village, and they must select quests to embark on. And this is technically true for Monster Hunter 2 DOS, both those things are there. However, the actual quest system is quite different, and I'll explain why. The quest system used in Monster Hunter Portable 2nd G, and virtually every other Monster Hunter title, is the same quest system as the one from Monster Hunter 1. In every Monster Hunter title except Monster Hunter 2 DOS, quests are separated by hunter level, by a rank or star level system. Within each bracketed rank is a variety of different quest types. Delivery quests are to gather, mine, catch, fish, or salvage a specific material for a client. Sometimes these quests are to carry a fragile material, such as an egg. Hunting quests are to hunt or capture large monsters for a client. Capture quests are to capture large monsters for a client. Slaying quests are to cull a number of small monsters for a client, and slaying quests are also used to specifically slay or repel an elder dragon for a client. By completing certain quests, termed key quests, the player unlocks the next bracketed rank, which theoretically has more difficult monsters. It's all really arbitrary. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the system is different. While the star ranking system does exist in the quest details, the quests are not separated by bracketed ranks. They are organically sorted by their locale, present factors, and monster variety. Furthermore, the quests are not separated by quest type. The details state a variety of goals for the player to complete. I have to make this clear. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, there's no gathering quests or hunting quests. They're just quests. They don't have those specific terms attached to them like they are in every other game. They're just goal completion quests. On top of that, the actual number of quests are extremely limited. There's only one true, I would call, gathering quest available for the entire game, and it's to collect 8 special mushrooms in the jungle. There are no harvest tour quests, so if the player wants to gather materials from a locale like the swamp, they will be required to accept a quest such as Hunt a Gypceros. Quests are more nuanced. The player has more activities to cover than just hunting large monsters or delivering an item. For this reason, Monster Hunter 2 DOS introduced the concept of subquests, which has been a feature that has been added and removed multiple times in the Monster Hunter titles over the years. The developers seem to be unsure whether this feature is necessary in the game. The truth is, Monster Hunter 2 DOS is the only title where it is absolutely necessary, and, in my opinion, is the best rendition of this concept. The seemingly missing delivery quests have been combined with the hunting quests, and they act as the subquests. Completing subquests allow the player to prematurely end the quest without completing the main goal, and offers separate quest rewards. This is useful for a smaller or specific reward. For example, egg-carrying quests are completely optional. They are only completed via subquests. Completing subquests also gives the player more supplies from the item box, so the game teaches the player to complete these subquests as often as possible. I compare this unique system of questing to Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise's expeditions. They are essentially 50-minute map explorations with a number of completion goals. The player may complete one or all of these goals, and they may have their own goals as well. For example, when I got to the Lunastra fight, which is Monster Hunter 2 DOS's final boss, I was more interested in mining for Dragonite ore because I knew that the Ancient Tower was the only place I could get Dragonite ore at the time. I have seen fans complain that there are too many gathering quests in the current titles. Perhaps the developers heard the complaints and desired to improve this in Monster Hunter 2 DOS by integrating all the gathering quests into the hunting quests, making them all essentially optional. As a result, the quest list is quite smaller than other games. In Universe, this unique system of quest goals ties itself better to the client's demands. If multiple clients desire for the player to complete many tasks out in the same map, why not combine the goals together? Though it should be noted that some quests do not feature subquests, and they are usually for monster subspecies or elder dragons. For these fights, the client only wants one thing done, the destruction of a single dangerous monster. The player unlocks new quests organically, not through any bracketed ranking system, but rather through assisting the village and receiving new client requests as the player completes greater challenges. The player might not even realize they are partaking in an urgent quest, because they don't call it an urgent quest. It's much less video game-ish, and it's more organic. On top of the quests functioning differently, the variety and choice of quests the player can partake in is tied to an equally unique day-night cycle and season cycle. Monster Hunter 2 DOS introduced a new system where it will transition from day to night in real time, and whenever the player travels on a quest, the locale will also be noticeably day or night. Usually it only lasts about the time of one quest, about 30 minutes, so when the player returns to the village, it will usually have switched from day to night, or night to day. I haven't properly touched on the game's home village, so I'll do that quickly. It's called Jumbo Village. It's a quaint tropical village with a handful of villagers, each with a lot of visual character. They are more lively than Monster Hunter 1's villagers, and they remind me of Monster Hunter 3 Try's villagers. The blacksmith is funny. She's this tiny woman who uses an oversized hammer to forge the player's equipment, but will also run down to the lower level to serve as the armory as well. The guild representative is this girl from the guild. She gives the quests. She's the same one you'll see in Portable 2nd or Generations. The traveling old lady with the big backpack will show up from time to time. There's this funny large fish man that the player can arm wrestle. The village's chief is always running from person to person taking notes, unless it's nighttime and everyone gathers around the quest bar. It's nice to see them have different personalities at different times of the day. It makes sense for them to relax after the sun is set. I find it refreshing to see Monster Hunter attempting to make these NPCs feel like they are actually living a life and not just standing around. The handler in Monster Hunter World is always just sitting and eating all day and all night long. Back on topic, the village is also affected by the changing seasons, which are also consistently transitioning in real time. The summer season is followed by the winter season, and then it finishes with a breeding or harvest season. I found that a whole year would go by over a playtime of 8 hours, naturally if you don't skip it, which seems like a lot of time, but then again, this is Monster Hunter. It typically takes at least 100 hours to complete every quest per title. During the breeding season, the village becomes more lively. Actually, the music changes depending on the season. It's all constantly transitioning. The season cycle never returned in any game, except maybe Frontier, but I don't know a lot about Frontier. We did see the day-night cycle return in Monster Hunter 3, but it was mostly inconsequential to that game, and it was removed for Monster Hunter 3G. It was absent for most of Generation 4. It's back in Monster Hunter World, but it's inconsequential, and in Rise, it's also basically gone. It's never nighttime in the village. When I say inconsequential, it's because in Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the current season and time of day has a direct impact on what quests the player can partake in. During the summer, the desert map is unavailable because it's just too hot. Likewise with the Snowy Mountains map, during the winter it's too cold, so the player just cannot go there. Certain monsters hibernate during the winter, and other monsters only appear at night. Some maps change drastically at night. In the swamp it stops raining and poisonous liquids begin to appear, which serve as an environmental hazard. In the desert it's cold at night, so the player will need to bring hot drinks instead of cold drinks. And the cave zone gets flooded with water, so it becomes inaccessible. The volcano gets violent at night, so certain paths are just completely blocked off. Hornetars tend to appear more often at night, so if the player wishes to get their carbs, they'll have better luck at night. The herbs used for making potions are only available during the day. The player is even less likely to find honey in the winter. There's so many, the list just keeps going on. The game wants the player to learn these particulars and properly prepare for them, like it's a strange survival game. Ultimately, this creates a unique experience that has the player choosing quests based on a variety of criteria, rather than just selecting the key quests to gain the next hunter rank level. Monster hunting is more organic and less like a modern Monster Hunter grind. Every quest is on a schedule and will eventually become temporarily unavailable as the cycles continue. The player can only do the same quest so many times before it becomes unavailable, due to a season change, or they just run out of resources for items, making it difficult to grind or farm for a monster. Since certain maps are only available at certain times in the year, the player will have to stock up on resources while they have the chance. This all plays into the philosophy of deliberate action. A lot of people have talked about this idea of deliberate action, that the older games, it's when you, in the combat, it's more focused on like you have to know where your placement is. But Monster Hunter isn't just about the combat, and I think that Monster Hunter 2 DOS really emphasizes that. Monster Hunter 2 DOS emphasizes that every decision matters. The quests the player chooses must be deliberate and planned out. If the player takes too long, the seasons will change. The player is given the option to sleep and skip a day or even a whole season, but it costs money. Money is very scarce in this game, and by charging the player, the game is indirectly punishing them for skipping. The game does not want the player to skip. It wants them to take advantage of every present moment. Like in the later games, villagers will have requests, either quests that unlock story-related elements, or item deliveries that upgrade the village amenities. These are wonderful for the immersion and simulation aspects. Rather than completing quests for clients the player never sees, these quests are all directly from the hunter's neighbors in the village. A villager is directly asking the player to hunt a monster or give them direct supplies. This is a feature that has been carried over into current games, such as Monster Hunter 4, but the deliveries aren't as personal when they aren't direct. Some of these requests, like the seasons, will change if one takes too long. A villager may request a, for example, Cephadrome Fang during the summer season, which happens to be the exact season that the player cannot access the desert, and thus cannot hunt a Cephadrome and obtain a Cephadrome Fang. This logically makes sense. The client would be in desperate need of an item that is temporarily impossible to get. In current Monster Hunter titles, players typically hoard an endless number of items, because you expect that at some point you'll probably need to use those 200 small monster bones sitting in the item box. The Monster Hunter titles from Generation 3 and onwards do not punish the player for holding onto items, and there's very little restriction. In Monster Hunter World, the item box will continue to gain pages as the player gains items. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the player starts with only one page in their item box, and item stacks max out at the same number they normally would in the item pouch. Meaning, if potions only stack up to 10 in the item pouch, potions will only stack to groups of 10 in the item box, not 99 or 1,000 or whatever it ends up going to in World. I've never reached the max. Because items stack so quickly, they'll usually take up more room compared to the other titles, and eventually the player will run out of room in their item box. The game requires the player to make a conscious effort to conserve their item box space. One can tell this game was made by the same people who made Resident Evil. With the game knowing the player is bound to sell some of their items to create room in the item box, I theorized that the game was balanced around selling items as a mandatory function to earn enough money for the costs within the game. I found myself running low on funds extremely often in Monster Hunter 2 DOS compared to other titles in the series. Why is that? Is the quest reward money lower in Monster Hunter 2 DOS? Well, actually, quest reward money is a bit more complex in Monster Hunter 2 DOS. Hunting reward money is often tied to the seasons and the time of day. Different times of the year have different reward costs for hunting different monsters. Making money fast may restrict what monsters the player would rather hunt the materials for. There is a hunting board that provides the daily bounty values per monster. With them constantly fluctuating, the game is attempting to illustrate the monsters as being bounties, and there are specific values in hunting them. The clients want certain monsters hunted at certain times. Better rewards are granted when it's more urgent, and not tied to how difficult the monster is. Again, this is an organic system. These monster reward values are actually separate from quest reward values. When the quest is completed, the player gets reward money for completing the quest, the subquest, account items sold, and finally, what the monster reward value is. This is a wonderful addition because it promotes the player to continue trying even if they faint. Fainting has no effect on the monster reward, only the quest reward. And the monster reward is almost always far higher than the quest reward. The player is still rewarded for their work, which is welcome when the game has the player scrapping for funds anywhere they can get it. Back on track now, I'll repeat my question. Why was I running out of money frequently in Monster Hunter 2 DOS? First, let's compare the hunting reward prices for hunting monsters between Monster Hunter 2 DOS and Monster Hunter World. Let's use a low-rank offline Rathian as an example. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, Rathian's reward is roughly 4,500 zenny. That's including the crest reward value and a median for the monster's reward value. In Monster Hunter World, Rathian's reward is a flat 4,300 zenny. So, about the same. I checked others, and the numbers seem to be roughly line up between the two games. So hunting reward prices haven't changed much, regardless of the unique system implemented in Monster 2 DOS. So why was I still low on funds? Are the prices for items higher? For a quick comparison, in Monster 2 DOS, a potion is worth 66 zenny, and in Monster Hunter World, it is also worth 66 zenny. You can check this with all the games, they're always worth 66 zenny. I checked other items and they all seem to match as well. They've actually remained very consistent throughout the Monster Hunter series. So then why am I running out of money? Are the prices for upgrading weapons higher? Well, let's compare the base Iron Longsword, comparing the initial creation to the upgrade that requires Dragonite Ore, as that's the highest it'll go in offline low rank. In Monster 2 DOS, it goes Iron Katana, which is 3,150 zenny to forge, Iron Katana Grace, which is 5,580 zenny to upgrade, Iron Katana Gospel, which is 9,420 zenny to upgrade, Eager Cleaver, which is 18,980 zenny to upgrade, Devil Slicer, which is 28,560 zenny to upgrade. In total, it takes 65,690 zenny to complete 4 upgrades to the Iron Longsword in Monster 2 DOS. Let's compare that to World. In Monster Hunter World, it goes Iron Katana 1, which is 100 zenny to forge, Iron Katana 2, which is 200 zenny to upgrade, Iron Katana 3, which is 1,000 zenny to upgrade, Iron Grace 1, which is 2,000 zenny to upgrade, and Iron Grace 2, which is 4,000 zenny to upgrade. In total, that's 6,300 zenny to complete forging and 4 upgrades to the Iron Longsword in Monster Hunter World. I think it's fair to say that we found the culprit. Let's compare these numbers to the reward money we get from monsters. How many Rathian does one need to hunt in each respective game to complete these upgrades? Well, if a Rathian in Monster Hunter DOS gives you 4,500 zenny, and a Rathian in Monster Hunter World gives you 4,300 zenny, that means in Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the player must hunt roughly 15 Rathian to fully upgrade their longsword. In Monster Hunter World, the player must hunt roughly 2 Rathian to fully upgrade their longsword. Yeah, I think there's a severe difference here, and don't forget, the player will probably end up blowing all their money on pickaxes because they break so frequently in this game, and to fully upgrade this Iron Katana, Monster 2 DOS asks for a grand total of 12 whetstones, 35 iron ore, 62 earth crystal, 61 macalite ore, 5 dragonite ore, and 8 electro sacks. Hope you like hunting Kezu. Just to be fair though, in Monster World it asks for 8 iron ore, 2 earth crystal, 2 coral crystal, 17 macalite ore, and 7 dragonite ore. It's a severe difference, once again, and that's only counting the ore. There are other materials needed, but my point was regarding the pickaxes anyway, and the pickaxes are of infinite use in Monster Hunter World. You do not need to buy them, it's just part of the player's permanent inventory. I'll have you know, I feel like I actually spent more money on just the pickaxes than I actually did to upgrade the weapon. Returning to my point before this tangent, does Monster 2 DOS make it mandatory to sell items in the item box? Absolutely. If the player hasn't upgraded the item box, which only increases to 4 pages by the way, it'll fill up in no time and the player will be forced to start selling items. Now, does Monster 2 DOS expect the player to regularly sell items in order to ensure they have enough funds for equipment upgrades? I'm fairly certain. Yes, actually, I think it does expect the player to do this. It's not a mandatory form of earning money. The player can always hunt more monsters for profit instead, but the monster rewards always end up having a higher sell value than the quest rewards money. Now, this is an interesting discussion because a lot of this script I wrote before Monster Hunter Rise, and Monster Hunter Rise isn't quite complete yet. There's still the updates coming, and it is something to note that I have found myself actually running out of money in this game. So it's interesting that Monster Hunter Rise returned to the low money standard that the old games used to have. That's a completely different discussion though, and maybe I should make a Monster Hunter Rise review. But anyway, back to my script. I always wondered why the game would give the player 2 minutes to decide what to do with the monster rewards after completing a quest, when the only thing I would ever do with them is send all to item box. They even added this as an option in Monster World and Rise. You'll notice in Monster 2 DOS, send to box is not an option. The player is only allowed to take the items directly and place them directly in their item pouch. If their item pouch is full, they are required to choose which items to take and which items to sell. I believe they put a timer there for multiplayer, so the player wouldn't waste 5 minutes deciding which items were more valuable when the other players were waiting back at the gathering hall. If the item pouch was full, the player may have to decide to sacrifice their potions just to take back a Rathian scale. In these scenarios, every decision matters. I theorize that the reason send to box was not an option in the first game was because it was intended to be that way. The developers aren't stupid. I legitimately think that the people at Capcom aren't stupid. They make mistakes, but I don't think that, I'm pretty sure this is deliberate. Otherwise, they wouldn't have put it into the game. As I've made clear before, the item box space was very limited in these older titles. I can piece together the developers likely wanted the player to think about their items more carefully. Back in the older Monster Hunter titles, the number of different carved materials was also lower. There was actually more shared rewards between small monsters and the larger monster counterparts. For example, if you carve a Velocidrome, the player is actually very likely to just gain Velociprey materials. Velocidrome specific materials are rare. They are rare carves and can be obtained through capturing the monster. These animals share materials because they are the same animal. Besides, if the player is hunting Velocidrome, then likely they're also hunting Velociprey for the subquest reward. If there were more separate Velocidrome materials as well as the Velociprey materials, the item pouch would fill up faster. With less different items to fill up the item spots, means the item box needs less item spots, and the same for the item pouch. The game was built with the understanding that the player couldn't send items directly to their item box, and that their item pouch was limited in space. I'm certain this is deliberate. I call Monster 2 DOS the antithesis to 5th gen Monster Hunter, especially Monster Hunter World, and this is because nearly every unique system I've discussed and examples I've listed so far creates a very different game experience. Monster 2 DOS treats hunting as an organic experience where it shifts as the seasons change, and as a professional experience where player meets client demands as a contract worker and earns money. This causes me to genre Monster 2 DOS as more of a simulation game rather than an action game. Starting in Monster Hunter Portable 2nd, the player was able to send quest reward materials directly to their item box. This has been the norm ever since. I can completely understand why most players prefer to have the option there. I explore a number of quality of life changes in part 7 of this video, but for now I'll just say that many of the quality of life changes have, absolutely, definitely helped the overall player experience without affecting game balance or game immersion. Why does this game require me to pull items out of the item box to combine them if they are still right in front of the player character anyway? Why can't I return to my house if I have a quest selected? These changes would make logical sense in universe, and thus they don't break immersion, nor do they affect the game balance in any way. It's funny how even in Monster Hunter World, you still can't actually enter your home with a quest selected. So is sending items directly to the item box a quality of life change? Sure. I mean, now that the player typically has near unlimited room in their item box, it has no bearing on the game. However, back in Monster 2 DOS, the game was built around this and was intended to be this way. In Monster 2 DOS, the player has a single item box that requires them to manually organize all their items from a single location within their house. There's no other item boxes anywhere. They must manually bring quest rewards to their house and store them manually. What the player brings with them is what the player brings with them. In Monster Hunter World, the player has dozens of item boxes in every corner of the world that contain all their items at all times and requires no maintenance. It's automatically maintained. Items are sent directly to the item box automatically with minimal menu navigation. So is one game better than the other? No. Don't make that the takeaway. They're very different experiences built for very different games. Is one easier to balance on a game design level? Perhaps. I don't know. Old school Monster Hunter is balanced knowing the player is limited on supplies. Monster Hunter World is balanced knowing the player has an incredible supply of everything ready at all times. To me, one seems more difficult to balance than the other, but I'm not a game designer. Playing Monster 2 DOS made me realize how much I stockpile resources in every other Monster Hunter titles. Why don't I sell items I'm not using? Is it human nature? In Monster 2 DOS, I had to change my perspective. I needed to teach myself to be comfortable selling items, because I can always hunt the same monster again and just get the materials again. The costs to forge new equipment and buy items are very high compared to what the player earns through being a hunter. So if selling items is what I must do, then sure, I'll do it. Ultimately, this is a simulation game where hunting is the career. Monster 2 DOS revolutionized how I view my item box and item pouch in Monster Hunter. In this game, it's more of a survival inventory, It's kind of like Minecraft in a way. These survival simulation aspects impacted the decisions I made on which quest to choose and how I spent each quest. I found myself gathering items every quest to make up for the items I consumed in previous quests. I found myself slaying Iodrome over and over again just because I actually wanted glue bugs or light crystals from the swamp, because it's not like there's a gathering quest I can go on that goes to the swamp. There just isn't one. I always wondered why the game gives the player 50 minutes out on a quest to slay the monster when usually it doesn't take longer than 10 to 20 minutes with average equipment and average skill. I've discovered that the intention is to actually spend 20 minutes of the quest just gathering items, combining potions, and cooking steak, not related to the main objective of the quest at all. I eventually had to train myself to be able to live without mega potions during the winter season, because of the scarcity of honey. Even if the player wasn't given the knowledge that honey wasn't available during winter, the game attempted to teach the player this fact by providing insect husks during the winter when gathering at honey spots. I was always confused why item husks was even in the game. Why? Like, they do nothing and they have no value. Well, as it turns out, in Monster 2 DOS, they added insect husks in order to teach the player that gathering was futile during the winter, since all the bees are dead. Soon I learned that insect husks could actually be traded with the Veggie Elder, and you actually get honey that way. On rare occasions, I would actually do this during the winter season if I was in dire need of honey. Trading with the Veggie Elder actually became a common thing for me to do. Before the volcano was unlocked, it's a faster method to gain Macalite ore than mining. Actually, the game requires the player to trade with the Veggie Elder at least once in the game in order to get a piece of the Ancient Tower book, which is required to unlock the final boss, the Lunastra fight. I know I've provided a bunch of personal experiences with the game, and that they hold little in this subjective discussion, but I hope that this narrative tangent on my Monster 2 DOS experience drives home my ultimate point on the game's unique experience. Monster 2 DOS pushes the player to have more nuance to their decisions, requiring the player to plan their hunts around the changing seasons and time of day. I believe the developers wanted the players to immerse themselves in the world like it's a simulation of reality. Because of these simulator aspects, the player's house in Monster 2 DOS has much more importance and much more weight to it compared to Monster Hunter titles that followed it. The valuable hunter notes are only available here, the item box can only be reached here. It's the location of the feline kitchen, it's the only place you can eat. It's also the only way to manually save the game without exiting. In Monster Hunter World, the player house is entirely optional. It's entirely aesthetic and cosmetic, and it's entirely inconsequential. Monster Hunter World can be completed without ever stepping foot inside your house. It's fun that you can customize it, though. Glad they added that.
Okay. Remember, this game came out in 2006, so if it looks weird, it's 2006.
Still with me? I said at the beginning that this would be a long video. I wasn't kidding. This next part is on Immersion. In the last part, I stressed the unique systems, time of day, and season cycles, the whole hunting reward business, and the item box system, because the uniqueness of Monster 2 DOS within the franchise can be viewed as an attempt to create greater immersion for the player. At least, I view it that way. I mentioned immersion at the beginning of the video. Now, look, immersion is a subjective quality. How immersed you are will be different for every individual player. However, the game developers will make deliberate choices in their game design to intentionally attempt immersion. The more the game acts like real life, a simulator game, the more likely the experience can be potentially immersive for the player. Whenever the game shows itself to be a video game, the more it will be potentially less immersive for the player. There's no guarantee it's going to be immersive for the player, but Capcom can at least attempt to try and make it more potentially immersive. For example, in Monster Hunter World, when they remove the loading screens in between the zones on a map, this theoretically may create a more immersive experience, because now the player isn't faced with a loading screen all the time. Monster Hunter World has improved certain immersive elements within the series, though I don't want people to misunderstand Monster Hunter World as being the best or most immersive experience in the series. Having higher quality animations or textures does not equal a more immersive environment. That's ultimately a subjective opinion. If seeing a higher quality image causes an individual to be more immersed, that's up to the individual to decide. A stronger point can be made to the interactions between the environment and the active models within them. Within every Monster Hunter title, The active models being the players, NPCs, and monsters all actively interact with one another. When a player approaches an animal, it is designed to interact with the player in some way. Having different interactions is what generates a more believable and thus immersive world. Specifically, when player inputted actions change the interaction between the player and the animal, it also lends itself to be a more immersive environment. The big point I want to make here, and I'm going to put it up on the screen here, no matter how good the picture looks, it's only a picture. The moment the player can actively interact with the picture is when it becomes an immersive world. Monster Hunter World is not any more immersive than any other title in the series. Furthermore, for every immersive concept that the developers attempted to add in Monster Hunter World was alongside the removal of other immersive concepts already present within the series. Monster Hunter World added Turf Wars, which was just a fancy name for infighting between monsters. This is also in Monster Hunter Rise. Large monsters will usually attack each other just if they happen to bump into one another. Turf Wars are a specific little animation that deals massive damage. This has been integrated into the game's balance, and the monster health numbers reflect the player's ability to stage a turf war. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, if a Rathian enters a Velociprey nest in the jungle, the Velociprey will attack the Rathian. There has always been monster infighting, and damage being dealt between monsters has always been a feature in the game. Only now is it more prominent. Look, we can consider Turf Wars to be an improvement to this immersive experience, absolutely. However, now small monsters rarely engage the large monsters. And the turf wars aren't always smooth, they are very specific gimmick animations. As for the hunting zones, Monster Hunter World advertises itself as a living, breathing world. Monsters feed on each other and interact with one another. Rathalos attacks and kills Aptonoff in the first game. This isn't a new feature by any means. Actually, with how fast Monster Hunter World wants the player to hunt monsters, I found monsters hunting one another to be a rare experience compared to Monster Hunter 3. In Monster 2 DOS, I found the Rathalos and Rathians' daily routines fascinating. They will drink water, patrol their nest, and even sleep on their own terms. Monster Hunter World did not do any of this first. Monster Hunter World advertises the concept of endemic life, smaller creatures that aren't considered monsters. This is also silly, because smaller creatures have been around since Monster Hunter 1 as well. The lobster in the old jungle actually interacts with the player character. Fish take up a large number of the endemic life entries in Monster Hunter World, and fish have always been around. Insects have also always been around, they were just smaller and didn't show up visibly the same way they do in World. So in this way, Monster Hunter World did improve because it lets the player see more of these creatures in higher detail, including the bugs being caught. Monster Hunter World did slightly improve the interactions on the hunting maps, but to say that these concepts were never there before is absurd, and while they did improve the fidelity of the things you are physically looking at on the hunting environments, the actual hunting mechanics continued to be streamlined, removing simulator qualities. My previous points on single item box systems, limited item space, the significance of time of day or season, the significance of hunting being the player's job and source of money, are all also elements of immersion that are missing now. In the beta trailer footage for Monster Hunter World, it showcases a hunter tracking an Anjanath, and eventually it uses the Anjanath to deliberately attract a Lagiacrus, the larger predator. This is a high-level interaction between the player and the environment that is completely missing in Monster Hunter World. Theoretically, the player could wait for the larger predator to seek out a meal, and simply wait near its prey, whatever the prey animal may be, such as an Aptonoff. However, this tactic literally can be found in Monster Hunter 1. The player is not actually interacting with the prey monster, they are simply waiting. There's a huge difference between waiting for a monster to arrive compared to forcing a monster to trigger another monster to arrive. In Monster Hunter World, it is possible to force a monster to trigger a turf war with another monster by purposefully luring one to the other. I concede there, this is actively forcing a monster to interact with another monster. This is good, we need more of this. Turf wars, unfortunately, I consider them gimmicky. A little pop-up occurs where the player is rewarded points, for some reason. The animation between monsters is difficult to cancel or interrupt, and ultimately the animation delivers itself to the player as damage dealt above all else. It is not structured as a mindful interaction between nature, but rather the equivalent to detonating a number of barrel bombs and getting rewarded for it. The opening cinematic for Monster Hunter 3 depicts monsters fighting over a potential meal. The figurative player is not involved. Many of the ecology videos showcase a far more believable world than the game offers. I do not think it is unreasonable for the developers at Capcom to restructure their game to allow for these interactions. I understand that the code required to pull this off is quite complex, otherwise it likely would have been added already. The unique interactions depicted in cutscenes throughout the series are an attempt to make up for the fact that developers simply can't make this as believable as they picture it. The cutscenes provide the player an example of what the world could look like if Capcom actually did, try to program better interactions between monsters. I'm surprised Capcom didn't make more of an attempt to make this a reality in Monster Hunter World. Let's hope that Monster Hunter 6 does better. I consider the Great Jagras consuming an Aptonoff to be, lazy in comparison to the cutscenes made for the Great Jaggy and the Great Baggy. The interactions between the alpha and younger bird wyverns depict a social dynamic, where they hunt together. In Monster Hunter World, the smaller Jagras, while they do spend time with the Great Jagras, they don't actually hunt with the Great Jagras. Again, monsters eating has been around since Monster Hunter 1, and alpha monsters social queuing smaller monsters to attack a prey monster in unison was finally brought into Monster Hunter Rise properly. This is a wonderful inclusion, and it would be great to see this alongside everything else, if the other interactions were actually present. The cinematics for Monster Hunter 4 showcase the use of items being very deliberate and careful. The hunter characters have to manually carry and place a barrel bomb if they plan to use it. This is seemingly an immersive concept the game could utilize. However, the game would rather prioritize being fast than deliberate. Thus, barrel bombs pop into existence upon being placed. It's been this way since the first game. I'm not saying that the next game needs to have the ability to carry and place barrel bombs like the cinematic, or that the game would be better this way. Rather, I'm stressing that there is a value to this style of game that has not been tapped into yet. That a greater focus on immersion could happen if the developers weren't focusing too much on streamlining DPS boss fights. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the cooking meal system is unique in that all the ingredients must be sourced within the field and be in the player's possession. In every other Monster Hunter title, the ingredients are always automatically available once the player unlocks them. Every time the player returns to have a meal, those ingredients will be present. They do have random rolls on which ingredients are fresh, which affects stamina level, but otherwise they are consistent. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the player must select ingredients from what they have in their personal possession, in their item box. Eventually, Jumbo Village does gain a food store that provides most of the ingredients the player would want, but that isn't until well into the game. There is also no in-game guide or guarantee that any of the food combinations the player selects will actually provide helpful buffs. It is expected to be all from player memory. Furthermore, the meal buffs change depending on the season. Preparing a meal with a spicy ingredient provides positive buffs during the winter, when it is cold. However, during the summer it provides negative buffs. This is in clear contrast to Monster Hunter World, which always provides a well-rounded meal option automatically for the player, with only positive buffs. Monster Hunter World prioritizes streamlining systems to make them effortless. Monster Hunter 2 DOS offers a simulator-like system that requires the player to be careful and immerse themselves in understanding how these in-universe meals work. I recently reviewed Monster Hunter 1's game box and instruction manual. The instructions placed a special emphasis on reward money being as valuable as monster materials. It puts special emphasis on survival and understanding monsters. It provides tips on how to track the monster and how to avoid detection. Overall, it asks the player to live in the world first and foremost. In Monster Hunter 1, understanding the world is more important than armor skills or meta endgame weapon configurations. These things didn't exist on the same level they do now. I discussed this in Part 6 in great detail. Monster Hunter 2 DOS took these concepts and buckled down on them. The overall hunting simulation lends itself better when the player is fully immersed. By forcing the player to memorize the schedules that the quests and gatherable items are on, they can perform better in the hunting of the monsters. Creating immersion for the player is extremely difficult to pull off. It's also difficult to simply tell the player to immerse themselves if they simply do not want to. I commend Monster Hunter 2 DOS for trying, and I don't blame anyone who plays this game to literally not care and give up because it's all too complicated. In my opinion, it is a shame that these new features in Monster Hunter 2 DOS were abandoned, instead of being improved. Monster Hunter World has so much potential to bring these concepts back for its living, breathing world that it advertises. I'm going to provide an example of a theoretical subjective experience I had when playing Monster 2 DOS, and another one from Monster Hunter World. Slaying a pink Rathian in Monster Hunter 2 DOS. Well, the pink Rathian is only available during the winter and breeding seasons, so I prepared myself in the summer season by stockpiling the items needed for potions and mega potions during the day. During the night, I stockpile flash bugs for flash bombs. Once it's the winter season, I eat a meal that I've memorized that will give me a positive buff. I then embark on the quest. I have to remember where the pink Rathian spawns, and if I don't make it in time to that zone, I have to memorize where the pink Rathian will likely go. Otherwise, I could try and attract her by playing a flute. Once I've finally found her, the fight begins. And now to compare, slaying a pink Rathian in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. The quest to fight a pink Rathian is always available. I already have 1000 mega potions on standby given to me through a free minigame. Flash bombs are given to me in the hundreds by this guy, with very little consequence. The game provides a meal selection for me that already has decent buffs. Once I embark on the quest, the scout flies automatically guide me to the monster, then the fight begins. These are very different experiences, and obviously the player could theoretically stockpile 1000 mega potions in Monster Hunter 2 DOS, however the process would probably take at least 1000 gathering quests in the jungle, and would fill up an entire page of items in the player's item box, which, as we know, is valuable space. Likewise, the player could theoretically simply not do the minigame in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, and gather 1000 mega potions via the environment. However, in both cases, this is not ideal and would take forever. Ideally, the player will play the best that they can for what they need to succeed, and in both cases the game is balanced accordingly. Monster Hunter 2 DOS expects the player to likely be running low on potions. Monster Hunter World expects the player to have an endless supply. The difference is how the game grants the player mega potions. One is an immersive experience that teaches the player to live off the land. The other is menu navigation that teaches the player to play a minigame. Simply saying that one is better than the other is difficult. Simply saying that the minigame is more fun than gathering from the environment is a subjective argument and thus holds no weight. If the game did not provide a player a faster alternative for acquiring items in the endgame, players would simply learn to work without them, or continue to use the original method of gathering. In my opinion, I believe that offering a faster alternative like this minigame overall hinders the game experience and causes it to focus on DPS boss fights over everything else, which is my overall thesis. Aside from speedrunners, average players are required to bring potions and mega potions to make up for any mistakes they make during battle. Monster 2 DOS wants the player to be conscious about their supply. Monster 2 DOS hinders the player from repeating quests via limiting the player's access to items and limiting the access to the quest itself through the season and time of day systems. Monster Hunter 2 DOS ultimately denies the player the ability to grind the same quests and monsters. Monster Hunter portable games created the modern grind as we know it today. If the player desires specific equipment or to raise their hunter rank, they are required to repeat the same quests over and over, hunting the same monster repeatedly. Monster Hunter World doesn't want the player to be conscious about their supply. Monster Hunter portable games only want the player to be conscious about the DPS boss fights, performing well against these formidable monsters. These games do not want the player to have to worry about their supply levels, so that they can continue the grind. These games allow the player to repeat these quests as fast as possible. Gathering in 5th generation Monster Hunter is now the fastest it's ever been. Collecting herbs instantly creates a potion, and gathering honey instantly combines with the potion into a mega potion. This would have been wonderful in Monster 2 DOS, where I have to do it manually in a menu. However, despite this wonderful improvement to the gathering system, it is a quality of life change that is a decade late. Monster Hunter portable games already normalized using a farm system to obtain mega potions without requiring any gathering whatsoever. It's more efficient to simply use the trader and rise, so why would the player even need to go out to gather on the map? Ultimately, we are still back to combining items and menus, just like Monster 2 DOS. The farm system itself is a whole subject that requires its own section to follow this. But to briefly segue, farming has also lost all importance and has been boiled down to just menu navigation that Monster Hunter World and Rise have barely attempted to improve. Alright, this section's actually pretty short. I'm just going to be talking about how the farm system has basically evolved throughout the Monster Hunter titles. The farm was introduced in Monster Hunter Portable. It is a small section attached to Kotoko Village. Is that how you pronounce it? Kotop? It gives the player the option to use a single gathered item, such as a herb or power seed, and plant it. The planted item would then grow and multiply after a quest. For example, by planting 1 herb, the player will have 5 after completing a quest. There is a mushroom box that the player can gather mushrooms at. There's also fishing spots, mining spots, and bug catching spots that are also free to use without the need of consumables like pickaxes or bug nets. The philosophy behind the farm was to let the player focus more on the hunts, since it was a PlayStation Portable title and they would ideally be playing it on the go. The farm requires leveling up through collecting account items and racking in village points. It took time. In my opinion, I find this to be a suitable reward for the player's time and dedication to the game. The player must still manually collect every mushroom and mine and catch bugs. It's the same activity as being out on the hunting map, it simply has the convenience of being next to the player house and does not require an active quest, as well as there's no enemy monsters attacking you. Portable 2nd and 2nd G expanded on the farm, bringing back all the features and adding a couple new ones. Portable 3rd also uses the exact same farm system. It is earned through deliberate work and patience. It still requires the same energy that's needed out in the field, but acts as a convenient reward to the player. If the player fails a quest, they can at least expect to have a honey box with 5 honey waiting for them. The player was never completely out of mega potions, and they could keep the hunt going. It's through the portable games that the focus on the hunt became increasingly more important than the gathering. I call Monster Hunter 2 DOS the last survival and simulator-focused game in the franchise, partially because it was the last game without a farm system. The player is required to manually gather the materials needed to make potions and other consumables regularly. Every quest requires the player to gather materials and combine potions and cook steaks. It's why the game gives the player 15 minutes to complete the quest. I've been over this. The player has limited item space, so they have to decide between items like honey or a Rathian shell, as I've said before. The player must think critically, because everything is critical. The player must dedicate time to prepare their hunter adequately for the big hunt. That means sacrificing the chance to hunt a monster that's only available during the summer season because the need to stockpile on honey and other items for the hunt takes precedent. As I've said before, certain monsters are only available during certain seasons. For the Gravios hunt, I was given a choice to hunt the monster on the last day of winter with limited supplies, or wait a whole in-game year to hunt with a fully replenished stock. That's hours of preparation. Of course, as the player approaches the endgame, obviously the shops will begin to sell consumables like potions. But, as I've mentioned in part 2, money is scarce in this game. The best means to get money is to hunt dangerous monsters and sell the rewards. Monster Hunter 2 DOS treats monster hunting like it's a job, because it is. It's a hunting simulation game. In Monster Hunter World Iceborne, as I've said before, the game gives you free Mega Potions through the Steam minigame. In Monster Hunter 3, the farm system was boiled down to give 1 gathered consumable of any kind and it'll be multiplied automatically every quest up to 10 times. If the player gives 1 honey, then return to the farm after 10 quests, they'll have about 30 to 40 honey, it depends. This is extremely helpful for the endgame. It requires resource points, a similar point system in the portable games, to do this. And you can either gain them through free hunting for the village, or trading specific commodities. Again, in my subjective opinion, I believe this is fairly balanced, and also a neat concept. It requires the player to be the village hunter, and the game rewards the player based on what monsters they hunt for the village. The player gets special unique commodities that can be traded for special items, and the village farm gives the player the consumables required to perform well in hunts. It plays into the simulation aspect of the Monster Hunter franchise. In many ways, it can be argued that Monster Hunter 3 Tri is more Monster Hunter rather than Monster Hunter Portable. The game pushes the player to actually hunt and gather for their village, rewarding the player for partaking in the simulation. I'm not surprised that this system was not normalized going forward. The Monster Hunter Portable philosophy of prioritizing the grind of DPS boss fights goes against the slower, methodical, immersive experience of the Monster Hunter philosophy. Monster Hunter 3's farm system was normalized by every title to follow. Not entirely sure how it works in Monster Hunter 4 on the lore side of things, but this buddy guy takes the player's items and multiplies them. Though, unlike Monster Hunter 3, the points required to do the item multiplication are far more common. Every time I've played Monster Hunter 4, I rack up so many points unknowingly that I'm never required to seek them out. Same with Monster Hunter Cross. It gives the player so many that it is a non-issue, and the player can do item multiplication without delay. Funny enough, in Monster Hunter World, the player will gain resource points just by looking at the monster. The farm system continues to remain as it was in Monster Hunter 4. The player is given the option to multiply items. It's not exactly necessary anyway, since collection of items are not restricted and you can also just trade materials to get them. The player can easily receive the ingredients to craft Mega Potions quite quickly. In Monster 2 DOS, Mega Potions require herbs that can only be found during the day, and honey that can only be found during the summer and breeding season. In Monster Hunter World, the player is also given the option to trade bones or other materials for Mega Potions with the Elder Melder. I'm honestly surprised the game doesn't just hand them over for free. Oh wait, it does, through the Steam minigame. I used to think that Capcom was prioritizing this style of game design to benefit speedrunners, but speedrunners don't need potions. Their goal is to never make a mistake. Rather, this game design seems to be catered towards prioritizing the combat above all else. Is this bad game design? No, it's fine. I like the combat in Monster Hunter like everyone else. This is what separates a Monster Hunter game from a Monster Hunter portable game. Gathering consumables is much faster in Monster Hunter World, as I've said. It's instantaneous with the press of a button, and it'll also auto-combine the potion on the spot. Blue mushrooms aren't even required to craft potions anymore, only herbs are required. With all the other options to get Mega Potions, gathering consumables has become trivial and unnecessary. The whole thing seems trivial and unnecessary, in my opinion. I can understand the developers' intentions. The ability to create potions on the field was in Monster Hunter 2 DOS and was a viable strategy. It would keep the fight going if the player is running out of supplies. However, this is nullified by the fact that the player can simply return to the base camp tent and access their entire supply of thousands of potions. Is this bad game design? No. It's just catered towards prioritizing the combat above all else. Though I do believe the importance of gathering has been completely lost, I believe a balance between these two concepts could create a very fresh and exciting experience. Everything up to this point is evidence and context to my thesis that the Monster Hunter franchise started as a fantasy hunting survival simulator action multiplayer series, but has been transformed into a fantasy hunting action multiplayer series. So basically, the survival simulator aspects have been removed. Quests already begin with supplying the player a limited number of consumables. I fear that eventually the game will normalize fully stocking the player every time, and it'll be considered a quality of life change, all in the effort to prioritize the combat above all else. This is great if you like combat. And don't get me wrong, I like the combat in Monster Hunter. It's a huge part of the game's appeal. It's unfortunate if you're like me and you like the simulator and survival aspects, because they are being actively gutted from the franchise. For Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, the developers decided to bring back the old desert map, the map from Monster Hunter 1. It even has the original music and the monsters. Unfortunately, what they didn't bring back was the actual map itself. It barely resembles the original on an aesthetic level, and the individual zones are cluttered with ledges to allow the player easier access to mount monsters. And I get it, this makes sense on a gameplay level. It would be smart to modify the map so it suits the new feature of mounting. It's unfortunate that this change came at the cost of losing what made the original map unique. It was a large open desert. Now it's a small arena. This is aesthetics, and we can't objectively quantify one as better than the other. However, I can reasonably state that the smaller zones make traversal faster. I believe they scaled down the zone size to reduce game time. Again, this is the developers wanting to prioritize combat above the simulation. While I argue that it's more immersive to have the player travel across a massive desert plain, it's much less combat friendly, and I understand that. The last true desert plain we saw in a desert-themed map was in the Sandy Plains in Monster Hunter 3 Tri. Monster Hunter World saw no effort to bring back a large desert plain with a wildspire wastes. Again, it was less of a desert and more of a cluttered gorge, and I get it, it benefited vertical combat to be designed this way. There are other maps I could attempt to argue also share this design philosophy, such as comparing the forests in Monster Hunter World to the forests in Monster Hunter 1, but I worry that the evidence just isn't strong enough for this video. Thankfully, Monster Hunter Rise brought back the sandy plains, and it's exactly the same as it was in Monster Hunter 3 Tri, just bigger, more to explore. This is nostalgically satisfying for veterans of the series such as myself. Monster Hunter Rise's maps are very large, open areas where the player is free to traverse. These new maps feel like a true return to form for the franchise. I worry that in Monster Hunter 6 they will attempt to add a replacement for the wire bug and Palamute to keep the player traversal speed high. I specifically play Monster Hunter Rise without a Palamute to slow myself down. The current Monster Hunter direction is pushing for faster and faster gameplay to ensure the player can get to the DPS boss fight as fast as possible. The game does not offer an experience where the player gets lost and immersed in these rather beautiful environments like Monster Hunter 1 and 2 did. Despite the return of the sandy plains in Monster Hunter Rise, they have not brought back the changing temperature system of the desert that was in Monster Hunter 3 Tri. Similarly to Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the desert would have different temperatures depending on the time of day. During the day, the desert plains are hot and require a cold drink. During the night, it is cold and the player must drink a hot drink. The changing temperatures can be argued as being part of an immersive experience, but more importantly, they were an extra challenge for the player, albeit a minor one. The game simply expects the player to consume a specific item in order to cancel the negative effects of the temperature. I understand the arguments that state that this is a positive change. The drinks take up a valuable spot for other items in the player's item pouch. The player is forced to consume them every 5 to 10 minutes in order to cancel the effects. It does seem arbitrary, I get it. This plays into Capcom's focus on prioritizing DPS boss fights over a survival simulator game. If Monster Hunter was still advertised as a survival game, it would be expected the player would acknowledge survival prioritizations as they would in a real-life scenario. If a hunter is hunting in the snow, perhaps they should protect themselves from the cold. Capcom removes the feature entirely instead of improving or fixing it. This is a trend. Refining the temperature system to be tied to the player armor is a decent solution. Every armor piece has a temperature rating, and the player is expected to equip specific equipment for the locale they are fighting in. If the player would rather prioritize an armor set that has a bad temperature rating for the locale they are hunting in, they could either eat a meal or improve their temperature, or use a consumable item like the original hot and cold drinks. This is all just an idea. No Monster Hunter game has ever implemented this. Either way, Monster Hunter Rise set another precedent that the series would rather prioritize the DPS boss fight in any way they can by removing more preparation and deliberate action taken by the player before embarking on the quest. In Monster Hunter World, they added a small arena that gives the player the option to fight any monster within. These tend to be the go-to for speedrunners. Makes sense, it's small and easy to work with, it's more predictable. For non-speedrunners, it's a simple location that makes farming monster materials slightly faster, again prioritizing fighting large monsters. Monster Hunter Portable Games focuses on a grind where it expects the player to hunt the same monster repeatedly as fast as possible to ensure the player receives large monster materials as fast as possible. Monster Hunter Portable Games thus put more value on large monster materials such as, a Rathalos plate, rather than gathered item consumables, like for example, a Dragon Toadstool. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, a Dragon Toadstool has more value than most monster carbs. Many of the large monsters actually share the monster materials of their small monster counterparts. I mentioned this in part 2, but to refresh, hunting a Velocidrome will result in mostly Velociprey materials. Hunting a Congalala will result in mostly Conga materials. By capturing the monster, the player has a higher chance of getting the specific large monster materials for that large monster. The game is balanced, expecting the player to not always capture the monster, so these specific rewards are considered rare drops. Monster materials aren't always exclusive to carving the monster. The player can receive Kutku scales from gathering at a honey hive during the breeding season. The player can also receive Kashela Diora scales from mining at the tower. The player can access weapons and armor without actually slaying these large monsters. The large monsters simply offer more rewards and a rare chance of 1 or 2 specific carves. Furthermore, more materials are shared between similar monsters. Blow's fangs are received from Diablos, Black Diablos, Monoblos, and White Monoblos. The Piscine fang drops are also shared between all Piscine wyverns, including the small Cephalos. Both Lunastra and Teostra share the same scale material, known as Fire Dragon scales. They are the same animal, so it is completely understandable that the material would be shared. In Monster Hunter World, while the Teostra drops Fire Dragon scales, just like the old games, Lunastra drops Lunastra scales. Monster Hunter World actively goes out of its way to prevent monsters from sharing materials. Without need to micromanage the player's inventory, they can add an endless number of arbitrary new monster material drops. In order to guarantee the player faces every monster, it creates separate drops for every monster that is not shared between monsters. Monster Hunter Portable games prioritize each monster as the new and next formidable challenge. The game progresses through a series of DPS boss fights. If there were workarounds in receiving materials through the other sources, the player would simply use the workarounds. The workarounds were placed in Monster Hunter 2 DOS deliberately. Kutku scales sell for a lot of money, same with the Kashela Diora scales. The large monster fights in Monster Hunter 2 DOS are far more difficult than the current games. The game doesn't want to punish the player by having the awful RNG prevent them from getting one extra Teostra scale. The player can fight the easier Lunastra instead and still gain the same reward. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the value of small monster materials are similar to the value of large monster materials. Slaying small monsters is just as important as slaying large monsters, just as it is important to gather materials. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Monster Hunter 2 DOS is a very different game with a different design philosophy. Going on a hunting quest involves more than taking down one large monster. It involves a number of activities. It's a simulator game. At some point, the developers decided that hunting and carving large monsters was the most fun aspect of the game, rather than adjusting and balancing small monsters to be equal, which is why Monster Hunter World rarely requires the player to fight any small monsters at all. Monster Hunter 2 DOS's tradition of providing small monster drops from large monsters actually did continue in the 4th generation. The material drop tables, while more generous, are essentially the same. When comparing a Velocidrome's materials between Monster Hunter 2 DOS and Monster Hunter 4, the player can still gain Velocipre scales from carving. The player can still gain Kutku scales from a honey hive gathering spot. Monster Hunter World was the first to completely drop this. The Great Jagras shares no materials with a regular young Jagras, as I've said before. In Monster Hunter World, it is impossible to gain a large monster material from passive gathering on the map. In Monster Hunter World and Rise, the useful materials are only obtainable from large monster fights. The developers have made the large monster fights the focus. There are less interruptions between the player and the monster. With tighter monster hitboxes, the player can hit the monster more and not be punished for standing too close. Players are rewarded for playing aggressively rather than playing defensively. In Monster 2 DOS, the useful materials are obtained from small and large monster fights. The game requires the player to actively eliminate both small and large monsters. Every monster is out to attack the player. Small monsters should be eliminated first before tackling the large monster. The monsters have larger hitboxes that require the player to keep their distance and play defensively and carefully. In Monster 2 DOS, the small monsters can still pose a challenge for players even with endgame gear. Remobra have nearly as much health as a Velocidrome. The Lunastra fight at the top of the tower forces the player to fight 3 Remobra, which are 3 Velocidrome level monsters, while fighting the Lunastra. This has never been the case in any Monster Hunter game to follow. The separation between small and large monsters has become more apparent in 5th generation, separating the hunter's notes of small and large monsters. I theorize that Capcom never intended for there to be a separation between these in the original game, but with the prioritization of the DPS boss fights in the newer games, it has become the norm ever since Monster Hunter Portable. Monster Hunter Rise has attempted to bring back focus on small monsters, but fails by making them too passive and giving them low health pools. They will never be the danger that they were in Monster Hunter 1 or 2. Small monsters have progressively gotten more docile. In Monster Hunter World, they would rarely attack the player. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, they will spot the player hunter from all the way across the other side of the zone and charge the player and relentlessly attack them. Comparing the behavior of crabs in Monster Hunter 2 DOS to Monster Hunter 4G shows exactly what I mean. In Monster Hunter 4G, the players can stand next to these monsters and after spending 20 seconds taunting the player, will they finally attempt to attack. It's not like the player has to fight back anyway. The Palicos will probably just kill the monster for the player. Crouching can prevent the small monsters from spotting the player, but it's never as practical as simply slaying them.
And that was the final boss, so I might get credits? Yeah! Ending cutscene! Wow! Wow, I beat Monster Hunter 2!
In Monster Hunter games, it is typically agreed upon that the endgame starts after the final boss is defeated, whether that be Monoblos in Monster Hunter 1, or Cedius in Monster Hunter 3, or Xeno'jiiva in Monster Hunter World. I would instead argue that the endgame actually begins when the game prioritizes the combat above all else. For those who haven't played Monster Hunter 1, it's only after the player defeats Monoblos that they unlock Gravios, Diablos, and Kezu, and these monsters are considered extra bonus hunts. It's at this point that the quest lineup is only difficult large monsters. No gathering, no small monster quests. With that logic in mind, I'd argue that the endgame of Monster Hunter 3 actually begins after the player has defeated Lagiacrus. At that point onwards, the game prioritizes mostly hunting quests and stops requiring gathering quests or small monster quests. In Monster Hunter 4, it's after the Gore Magala, and in Monster Hunter World, that would be after the Great Jagras. Oh. Yeah, this train of thought is subjective, and I think it's lost its point. The takeaway I had is that there is a moment in each Monster Hunter title where the game stops being a hunter-gatherer game and just becomes a hunter game, which I guess is in the name of the series. The game will begin to provide the player more ease of access to consumables and pushes the player to prioritize hunting and grinding / repeating the same hunts over other activities. Back in Monster Hunter 1 and Monster Hunter 2 DOS, once the player has reached my interpretation of the endgame, they slowly go through each of the unlocked final large monsters one at a time as challenges, just like the modern Monster Hunter titles. The difference is, they cannot truly grind these fights. The game requires the player to partake many quests in between each of these final challenges to stockpile the necessary resources. If the player fails the quest, they'll have to spend some time stockpiling before attempting it again. Every decision is deliberate and critical. Of course, the other option is to go speedrunner mode and just learn the monster's attacks and patterns and learn to counter them without any consumables. I had to do this a couple times. The archaic controls don't exactly make it easy though. Look, you don't actually need to play Monster 2 DOS like I've described it. If you're good enough at this game and you just never get hit, you just play really well, then do that. This is old school Monster Hunter. You really only had to hit the monster like 25 times. This is back when a greatsword hit could one-hit kill a Velocidrome without any buffs. If the controls were like the modern games and there weren't consistently 6 other small monsters attacking you alongside the big one, this game wouldn't be too difficult, right? I've seen the common complaints that the hitboxes are terrible in the older titles. Everyone hates the Plesioth. The Plesioth has a massive hitbox. So what? Learn the monster and keep your distance. Every time he jumps out of the water, just wait for him to shoot water and smack his head. It's the safest spot to be. Hitboxes are hitboxes. With each game, hitboxes are getting tighter and tighter, but ultimately it doesn't matter how tight it is. If the game is designed to punish the player for attacking the legs, then just don't attack the legs. Use a different strategy. Sure, it's a slower fight than the other monsters, but Monster 2 DOS wasn't about fast DPS, it was about strategizing and thinking carefully. The tighter hitboxes in current games has only made hitting the monsters easier, which has likewise caused the developers to increase the monster's health. Now the hunts require the player to hit the monster more. It's less about being extremely careful and deliberate, but rather about prioritizing getting as many hits as possible. Obviously the player is still required to telegraph and learn the monster. But with tighter hitboxes, a skilled player will be taking relatively less hits due to hunter positioning in relation to the monster compared to the older titles. And a non-skilled player is simply just going to tank through the attacks because of their unlimited potion supply. Monsters also tend to do more AoE attacks and range attacks now, so it's all just a balancing act. Alatreon in Iceborne is an interesting fight. It has very tight hitboxes, and with practice, the player can quickly memorize the patterns and learn to take advantage of them. He'd be easy if it wasn't for the incredibly high health number he has. On one hand, it reminds me of the old games, because careful player positioning is key, but it's also Monster Hunter World, so it requires prioritizing DPS. The DPS checks are specifically to make the player prioritize DPS. The concept of DPS check is interesting on its own. The reality is that ever since the first game, every single quest has a DPS timer. It's the 50-minute timer. If the player doesn't kill the monster in 50 minutes, the quest ends in immediate failure. But why punish the player for taking too long? Why did the developers put a 50-minute timer in the quest at all? Was it because of multiplayer? Back to the Plesioth fight in Monster 2 DOS is extremely difficult. It's because of the small monsters, as well as the Plesioth's AI, which is programmed to stay in the water for most of the hunt. The player must kill all the small monsters before they face the Plesioth. The player must wait for the Plesioth to exit the water, and then attack its head and keep the distance. Taking it slow is fine, but eventually the player will start to run out of time in the quest. This is not nearly as stressful as Iceborne Alatreon, but my point is that tighter hitboxes is partially why there's been a focus on DPS, and more DPS checks, aside from the typical 50-minute timer. A good strategy for Plesioth in Monster 2 DOS is to poison it. While it swims in the water, it'll be poisoned and thus damage is being dealt even if the player can't actively attack it. Was this the intended way to defeat Plesioth? What is the proper intended way to defeat Plesioth? What did the developers want the player to do? Aside from, using a ranged weapon. Logically, a monster that ecologically prefers to attack from a safe spot in the water would do so. I would consider this an immersive element. In Monster Hunter 3G, the player can simply follow Plesioth into the water and continue the fight underwater. The immersion is not lost in this aspect. Fights like the one against Plesioth in Monster Hunter 2 DOS are rare in modern Monster Hunter titles, which is why the best one I could compare it to was Elatreon. This is why I'm fairly certain that the developer's design philosophy mentality in the modern titles is to prioritize DPS boss fights. If Plesioth returns in any of the future games, we shouldn't expect the fight to be anything like how it was in Monster Hunter 2 DOS. Plesioth in its original state just takes too long to fight, and the developers want DPS boss fights, not a slow and patient fishing boss. If it's not a DPS boss fight, remove it, instead of improving it. Even when they did improve it, like in Monster Hunter 3G, it was using a feature, underwater combat, that didn't return in future titles. Instead of adjusting underwater combat to be less clunky, it was just abandoned. Better solutions exist outside of prioritizing DPS boss fights. The prototype footage for Monster Hunter World shows a very different game, where the player can lure one monster out by baiting another monster. Just as the player could use a frog to fish out Plesioth, the Plesioth could be pulled out of the water in other ways. The Plesioth was given a cameo role in Monster Hunter 4. The monster is still in the game, and the players can still receive materials from the monster without actually going on this long and tedious hunt. It's not a perfect solution, but it's something. Another example, Elder Dragons don't get repelled anymore. The player is now required to slay them within a single quest. For newer players who may not know this, in Generation 2, Elder Dragons had very high health numbers, and it proved difficult to slay them within a single quest. If enough damage was dealt by the 25-minute mark in the quest timer, the Elder Dragon would leave the hunting map altogether and go to a different map. The quest would still be considered a success, and its health would be carried over to the next time the player chooses to fight it. In Monster 2 DOS, if the map that the dragon went to was inaccessible because of the season, the player would have to wait for the seasons to change before they can finish the fight. The season and time of day system went hand in hand with this repelling system. This builds on the immersion element, in my opinion. Elder Dragons are regarded as significantly more powerful than average monsters within the game's lore. Trailing the monsters across different maps is an interesting mechanic that has been left behind because it doesn't hit the quota of fast DPS boss fights. Now players slay Elder Dragons within a single quest. They do not get repelled, and if you wait for them to be repelled, it'll end in a quest failure. Their health numbers are now similar to other large monsters. Bizarrely, they removed the mechanics behind poisoning Cashella Diora to lower its wind barrier in Monster Hunter World. The equivalent now is Elder Seal, which is fine, but why remove the other functional method? Another method in Monster Hunter 2 DOS was to cut off the tail and break the horns. This would also take down Cashella's wind barrier. This option was removed in Monster Hunter 4. Seems odd. It was a logical strategy that was built around the monster's biology. Learning the monster's biology leads to a better hunter, right? Having options is great, so why did you remove them, Capcom? So this section is to discuss weapon and armor systems. I firmly believe that the new standards in weapon and armor abilities have caused a drastic increase in monster health over the years, which has also played a part in the focus of high DPS over deliberate careful action. To compare, let's first look at the health points of a low-rank Rathalos from various titles. Please note that there is a chance any of these health numbers might be inaccurate, but I personally trust these sources enough to use them. As we all know, these games do not give these numbers directly. These have to be calculated or gained through data mining. Low rank Rathalos. So some things to note. All the numbers here should be for low rank online multiplayer. Alright? I was not able to find accurate data for the 3rd generation, so it's missing. Monster Hunter World's health numbers scale with multiplayer, so it only gets to be as high as like the 10,000 if there are 3 or 4 players on the quest. Monster 2 DOS and Monster Hunter Double Cross have fluctuating health numbers. These are randomly selected the moment the quest begins. They're not based on whether or not you are playing with more people. And also, Kiriniko's numbers for Monster Hunter 4G do not seem to be very specific. They also don't feature the variation in health numbers like the other titles do. I'm actually hesitant to call them accurate or helpful in this discussion, but I'm keeping them in there for comparison anyway, and I just pray that they are correct. Just from these numbers alone, the only takeaways I can make is that it maybe in 4th generation the health numbers were dropped, but then they were picked back up in Monster Hunter World. Regardless, it seems that Monster Hunter World has some of the highest numbers, but nothing extreme. Now let's see the high rank numbers, again with the same context and notes. High rank Rathalos. This is where Monster Hunter 4G begins to feel inaccurate, though the data between Monster Hunter 2 DOS and Monster Hunter Double Cross are actually pretty close to each other. But when we compare Monster Hunter 2 DOS with Monster Hunter World, you'll see that the single-player version of Rathalos in World is actually about the same as the online Rathalos in DOS. Once it gets scaled for multiplayer, however, it sits at a whopping 14,000, which is nearly double that of an online Rathalos in DOS. Moving on to G-rank numbers, Monster Hunter 2 DOS never had a G-rank, so I'll be using Monster Hunter Portable 2nd G for the G-rank equivalent of the 2nd generation. Much of the equipment and balance for Portable 2nd G is pretty close to Monster Hunter 2 DOS, so I'm hoping this is a fair replacement. This is the G-rank Rathalos numbers. It's at this point that it should be clear that the monster health has bloated immensely in 5th generation. Monster Hunter Double Cross had a bit of bloat, but that was because Monster Hunter Cross, the original game, its endgame had a pseudo G-rank with the inclusion of hyper monsters on the hyper monster upgrade system. The true G-rank in Monster Hunter Double Cross was basically more of a G-rank part 2, so the even higher numbers kind of make logical sense in that regard. What seems kind of insane in the drastic increase is Monster Hunter World's G-rank, which is nearly 4 times greater than Portable 2nd G when playing in single player, but it's nearly 8 times greater when you play with 3 other hunters. I'm sure other players have noticed this while playing Monster Hunter World Iceborne. The health numbers are drastically bloated compared to even high rank numbers. The easy scapegoat seems to be the Clutch Claw, which is absolutely reasonable. The Clutch Claw was essentially required to abuse during any hunt, as it allowed for dealing massive damage numbers when the monster was sent into a wall or became tenderized by the Clutch Claw's special attack. The Clutch Claw also affected the power of Tenderizer, which was already a very powerful armor skill. The game was balanced knowing the player could abuse these features, so they had to increase the health numbers accordingly. There is also a large number of environmental traps and triggers that can do massive damage to the monster. The Turf War gimmick also allows for damage to be dealt. Being able to restock the player's entire item supply infinitely also leads to abuse. See, I find this to all have an air of contradicting design philosophy. Take, for example, the player doesn't use any environmental traps or gimmicks at all and focuses primarily on the abilities as a skilled player. The player will DPS their way to victory. This is fine. Depending on their skill level and their equipment, they may finish the quest very fast or very slow. There are a lot of variables there. Meanwhile, for another example, the player bases their tactics slowly around environmental traps and gimmicks. I don't think it's possible to actually kill any of the monsters using gimmicks alone. The player is still required to complete the quest through DPS and player skill with the weapon. So why were the gimmicks added at all? They don't do much, especially in G-rank where the health numbers are inflated so much. It seems the developers still want the player to play the game like there aren't any environmental traps. I can understand the argument that the player is meant to incorporate both gimmicks and normal play into the hunt, but usually just playing well with the weapon is more advantageous and deals more damage overall. This is an interesting rabbit hole to go down, but it does not suit my video. The topic of environmental gimmicks are something that should be discussed separately from this video. Feel free to let me know in your thoughts below. I do think it's interesting that they did remove environmental traps from Monster Hunter Rise, and it's also interesting to note that the Time Attack wiki rules for speedrunning have all environmental traps considered forbidden. Take that as you will. Returning to the discussion of inflated monster health, I believe the actual main reason the monsters have such inflated health is because of the new armor system introduced in Monster Hunter World. They have made it extremely easy to stack skills that raise attack and affinity. Attack up level 7, which increases attack by 21 and affinity by 5%. Elemental attack up level 6, which increases elemental damage by 20% and adds a straight 100 on top. Ailment attack level 4, which increases ailment buildup by 30%, plus another 10 ailment. Critical Eye level 7 increases affinity by 40%. Critical Boost level 3 increases damage dealt with critical hits by 40%. Weakness Exploit level 3 increases affinity by 30% when attacking a monster's weak point. It also increases it to another 20%, making it 50% on wounded parts. Critical Draw level 3 increases affinity on draw attacks by 100%. Latent Power level 7 increases affinity by 60%. Agitator level 7 increases affinity by 20% and adds plus 28 to attack value. Peak Performance level 3 adds plus 20 attack value. affinity.
Heroics level 7, when the conditions are met, increases attack power by 40%. Fortify can increase your attack by 10%, and then another 10% can be stacked on top of that. Resentment level 5 adds plus 25 attack. Artillery level 7 increases specific attacks by 50%. Maximum Might level 5 increases affinity by 40% when stamina gauge is full. Affinity Sliding increases affinity by 30% after sliding. Crit Element increases elemental damage when landing critical hits. Crit Ailment increases ailment buildup when landing critical hits. Non-elemental Boost increases attacks on weapons that do not have an ailment or element. Blunt increases attacks as the weapon loses sharpness. Teostra's Technique prevents the weapon from losing sharpness when landing critical hits. Free Element adds an element or ailment to a weapon that normally wouldn't have one. Namiel's Divinity adds free element and increases elemental damage. Frostcraft makes the weapon gain more attack as it's kept in its sheath. Offensive Guard level 3 increases attack by 15% after doing a well-timed guard. Coalescence level 3 increases attack by 18%, elemental attack by 90%, and element buildup by 15%. The Barioth Hidden Art adds a stun effect to draw attacks and increases attack. Safi'jiiva's Seal level 5 increases affinity by 40%, increases elemental by 150, and ailment by 120. Elatrion Divinity increases elemental attack accordingly to elemental defense number. Getting 100% affinity in Monster Hunter World is so incredibly easy, it's become the norm to see a critical hit flash with every attack. I pose the question, why even have a system of RNG critical hits at all when it's so easy to just guarantee them? In Monster Hunter Rise, they even added a weapon that already has 100% affinity. This has never happened before. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, there are 4 skills to increase attack or affinity. There's Attack Up. At level 3, it's plus 25 attack. Ailment Up, which increases ailment by 125%. Potential, which at level 2 increases attack by 50% when health is below 40. And Reckless Abandon, which at level 3 is a combination of Mind's Eye, so weapons don't bounce, and it adds plus 15% affinity. 15! That's all the player can increase their affinity by. 15%. The absolute highest a weapon affinity can reach in Monster 2 DOS is 45%, and that's only with certain endgame weapons that already have plus 30 affinity, and they're very uncommon in this game. Increases in affinity has led the developers to start adding more weapons with negative affinity to balance. Meanwhile, in Monster 2 DOS, not a single longsword, dual blades, hunting horn, gun lance, or light bowgun have a weapon with negative affinity. That's 5 out of the 11 weapon types available at the time without any negative affinity. And another thing, I want to discuss the Power Charm and Armor Charm. Both of these have been in the series since the very first title. Because money was more difficult to acquire, these were a luxury if the player could afford them. They slightly increased attack and defense similarly to Attack Up or Defense Up skills. Remember, in Monster Hunter 1, there was no feature to upgrade armor. When an armor piece was forged, the defense remained at whatever the defense was, so getting the Armor Charm was very valuable. These charms have importance as receiving the Attack Up or Defense Up skills were also less openly available. In Monster Hunter 1, there was no option to use decorations because decorations and talismans were not yet implemented into the series. Item space was extremely limited in Monster Hunter 1 and Monster Hunter 2 DOS. The player only had 20 spots in their item pouch. If the player prioritizes these charms, they lose precious item space. Compare this to Monster Hunter World, which offers the player significantly more item space, more than triple the original amount. It's become extremely easy to purchase these charms immediately in newer titles. Usually around halfway through low rank, the player will see them in the item shop, and I would be genuinely surprised if a player said that they weren't able to afford them in any title past Generation 3. Of course, Monster Hunter Rise changed this, that Monster Hunter Rise was the first game in a while where I actually had to sell stuff in order to buy it. I do enjoy that in Monster Hunter 3 Tri, the player can only get these charms via trading with the Argosy. I feel this encourages players to play the game more to the simulation aspect, as they need to hunt the monsters for the village in order to get the items to trade for the charms. Overall, at this point in the series, these charms are just more of a mandatory buff that the game developers expect the player to carry in their pouch at all times, thus balance the game around it, thus increasing the monster health. It's obviously not possible to stack every single attack skill in Monster Hunter World all at once. That would be insane. There's, of course, limits. But my worry is that with more of these attack skills being added, the more the monster health will be inflated. The more the game will expect the player to build armor sets around the attack boost meta. In the older Monster Hunter titles, the player could maybe get one of the attack boost skills, and that would be extremely helpful in combat. However, the game was not built around the player having easy access to these skills. Rather, the game was built around knowing the player player would likely be using other skills, like anti-theft. Monsters like to steal items, especially the cats. They will make a beeline straight for the player and immediately steal supplies. It's fast and aggressive. Monster 2 DOS doesn't really require the player to have any specific attack boosting skills. The armor skill attack boost is so minor, and the player can get an equivalent boost just by eating a meal in their home. Rather, the game requires the player to have health boost skills, monster scouting skills, or map skills, or gathering skills, as these elements require the player's time just as much as the actual combat. Modern Monster Hunter games are prioritizing DPS boss fights over other elements. When I first played Monster 2 DOS, I found myself having more trouble with the small monsters and gathering materials, and that's just because I needed to change the way I play Monster Hunter. I discovered that there's far more to this game series than just one-on-one DPS boss fights, and the series decided not to explore these concepts, but rather shut them down before they can be improved. I have a bold and wacky suggestion to Capcom I'm gonna make, based off of my completely personal subjective opinions. It'll be really quick, then I'll be back to the objective stuff. Basically, I think the game would be better without any attack boost skills from armor whatsoever. We already have a viable method to increase attack, and that's by upgrading weapons at the blacksmith. Any additional attack boosts should be solely through food or item buffs. We should put more value on the power charm and food skills. Weapon proficiency and player skill are still what's ultimately important. Numerous stat boosts are pointless when the monster will be balanced to match it anyway. Surely increasing numbers doesn't make the game any more enjoyable, not compared to playing to master the monster's movesets and player positioning and decision making. That's why people like speedruns. I firmly believe the game would benefit if armor skills focused primarily on defensive skills instead. This would open the window for players to prioritize counter builds to monster abilities. I found myself just learning to work through the pain of ailments such as paralysis or KO. I also just learned to iframe the effects of monster tremors. This is because I'm prioritizing attack boosts and building for the meta, instead of, slotting in defensive skills that nullify paralysis or KO or monster tremors. Simply nullifying the effect altogether makes the hunt easier too. In Monster Hunter World, it becomes easier to nullify monster effects because of the new armor system, and obviously nullifying the effect altogether would make the hunt easier. Though, Capcom decided to balance this by making the monster effects worse to deal with, and because Monster Hunter World made it easier to slot in decorations to cancel out these ailments, they had to balance the game by making the monster effects and ailments worse to deal with. This is a neat idea. Unfortunately, the meta demands the player to prioritize attack boosts to counter the insanely high health numbers of monsters in G rank. Why even offer the player the ability to counter these monster effects and ailments while the game tries to teach the player to simply get good? I forgot to discuss this in the script, but I understand that there's an appeal to the simple nature of upgrading equipment. I do understand that there is an appeal to seeing the critical flash on every hit. You spend, the first 200 hours of the game, and, you're never able to get 100% affinity, and then after those 200 hours, you suddenly now get 100% affinity on every single hit. I understand the appeal, and it feels like, wow, I've really worked up to this. And I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that we shouldn't have any upgrades whatsoever. Like, look, I don't want Monster Hunter to be Dark Souls. What I'm saying is that armor should be built to be armor, defensive, while weapons should be built as offensive, and that we should return to how it was in Monster Hunter 1, so that if you're upgrading your weapon, that's how you upgrade your attack. If you upgrade your armor, that's how you upgrade your defense, and we keep those separate. But I understand that that is a very bold suggestion for the franchise, and not everyone's going to agree with it. I'm going to use this to segue into how Monster Hunter 2 DOS's armor system compares to Monster Hunter World. Monster Hunter World's armor system attempts to harken back to Monster Hunter 1 and Monster Hunter 2 DOS's armor meta, where each piece of armor in Monster Hunter 1 and 2 DOS had a number of seemingly random skills. When the player prepares a full armor set of Velociprite armor, for example, Their skill points amount to very little, a couple points in 20 different skills, granting them basically no effects. The game was asking the player to mix their armor pieces with others to gain these different skills. In Monster Hunter World, individual pieces of armor could typically carry 1 or 2 skill points in 1 or 2 skills, but the catch being that the player only needs 1 skill point for the skill to activate. As I mentioned earlier, this leads to monster effects and ailments like tremors to be balanced accordingly. Meanwhile, the system also lends itself better for mixed sets, as one could gain the skills from individual pieces rather than the combination of pieces. Mixed sets have always been a part of the meta in every Monster Hunter title. From Monster Hunter Portable 2nd and onwards, there was a focus on making specific armor sets from a single monster and granting a couple of useful skills when built in full, as opposed to seemingly 20 random skill points in random skills. This is all very complex. Here's some examples. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, if you want to attack up, you have to carefully choose 5 pieces of armor that give you plus 10 attack up skill points. In Monster Hunter 3, if you want to attack up, you craft Jaggy armor, or another armor that just has attack up when assembled in full. In Monster Hunter World, if you want to attack up, you craft 1 piece of equipment that gives you attack up. So again, Monster Hunter World seems like a step in the right direction, but they introduce set bonuses, which are basically like Generation 3 and 4's philosophy. Build the entire armor set and get a specific skill that can only be received from that armor. Many of these set bonuses are superior to the individual skills. It's as if the developers are confused on which path they want to take for the armor system, individual pieces and mix sets, or full same monster sets. Monster Hunter 2 DOS, like every Monster Hunter title before Monster Hunter World, separates Blade Master and Gunner armor into separate categories. I do agree that combining them was a good change. The separation only really doubled game time overall if you happen to be a collector. The only downside is that it did remove the fantastic armor designs for gunners, and that's up to the individual if you were okay with this. Personally, some of the gimmicks between Blade Master and Gunner I found to be pretty cool. I liked how the Kezu armor for female was, for the Blade Master, a nurse, and for the Gunner was a bandage patient. We do get the alpha and beta set system in Monster Hunter World, which is designed for prioritizing decorations. The visual designs, however, still catered more to Blade Master rather than the Gunner aesthetic. Monster Hunter Rise has ditched that, and there is only Blade Master designs. Monster Hunter World also removed the negative skill points. This is a big gameplay change in armor management. Negative skills were there to balance armor sets and to encourage mixed sets. It's easy to cancel negative skills since the player could theoretically slot in a decoration to cancel out the negative skill. Bear in mind, decorations were introduced in Generation 2 and the player cannot do this in Generation 1. Negative skills were put in place purposefully from the beginning. Furthermore, decorations had negative skills as well to ensure the player couldn't stack so many skills at once. That's why they typically prevent the player from having both handicraft and sharpness skills at the same time, or having both attack up and defense up. They are quite powerful when paired up, and the game doesn't want you to be able to have those. The game was balanced to prevent the player from stacking too many offensive skills. On top of that, it was usually a trade-off between whether to slot in something to remove a negative skill, or use the open slot to gem in another positive skill and just deal with the negative skill. I should mention that the negative skills aren't really required to balance the game. While I do find the Monster Hunter World system is extremely unbalanced as it offers the player too many options to stack abilities, adding negative skills isn't exactly the best solution. The best solution is to simply offer less options to stack abilities. Monster Hunter Rise thankfully is attempting to fix this issue. Rise is probably my favorite game for mixing sets. There's no overpowered set bonuses, and true mixing and matching is a nice return to form. I want to also point out that in Monster Hunter 1 and 2 DOS, because the developers expected the player to mix the armor pieces together, the individual armor pieces were designed to look appealing when mixed with random other pieces. For example, the Kirin armor uses Gypceros materials, and there are parts of the armor that are notably Gypceros in aesthetic. However, because in Monster Hunter Portable 2nd and onwards the armor meta was changed to complete sets, they were designed to be worn as complete packages. This results in some of the mixed sets in Monster Hunter Rise to clash aesthetically. But that's just an opinion. I said previously that Monster Hunter 2 DOS introduced the decoration system. I haven't decided if the decoration system was overall a good idea or a bad one. It heavily relies on context as each game has been balanced differently, so that's up for separate discussion. As for Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the decoration system was a little rough. The players can only slot them in or remove them via the blacksmith. The player cannot adjust their armor decorations through their item box, and decorations could not be transferred via saved equipment loadouts. Decorations didn't require many materials to forge, but that was to balance the fact that decorations would be lost forever if the player removed the decoration, or during specific upgrades to the weapon or armor it's slotted in. Yes, I'm serious. it would just disappear. Moving on, Monster 2 DOS also introduced the ability to upgrade armor, though armor spheres were not used in this game. It was a system just like the weapons, where upgrades are required through a variety of monster materials. This is interesting because it actually puts more value on the upgrade, and the game expects the player won't be able to easily upgrade their armor to its max level at any given time. Similar to the values of monster health points, monster attack values have also been bloated to match the high defense numbers possible in recent Monster Hunter titles. It's completely reasonable to balance the game accordingly. Though, I bring forward the statement, the developers wouldn't need to bloat the damage numbers if they didn't increase the defense numbers so high to begin with. Armor spheres were introduced in Monster Hunter Portable 2nd. They were essentially just a streamlining upgrading armor so it's less effort and game time, though armor spheres were locked behind different quest ranks. It formed an artificial barrier of when the player could upgrade their armor. Monster 2 DOS also does have an artificial barrier of when the player could upgrade their armor. Usually the game requires a Remobra carve to upgrade all armor pieces at some point, and the player can only find Remobra closer to the end of the game, at the volcano or the tower. Artificial thresholds for upgrades are fine, it prevents the player from being too powerful too early. The more nuanced in how they are incorporated makes the process more fair to the player experience. In Monster Hunter World, defense upgrades are stopped via artificial thresholds in the campaign. The blacksmith just suddenly says the armor upgrade cap has been lifted. I have no idea how a trained blacksmith, one sent by the guild to serve as the main blacksmith for an entire army sent to the new world, is incapable of upgrading armor to its max level immediately, and for some reason requires the player to defeat a specific monster before he can suddenly just start upgrading the armor more. It's just extremely arbitrary. I should mention that Monster Hunter 2 DOS is not safe from this criticism either. It also puts arbitrary campaign thresholds on armor upgrades as well. It'll tell the player a piece of equipment is maxed out and cannot be upgraded any further. If the player assists the blacksmith lady with her requests, her forge will upgrade and she will hire some more assistants to help her. Suddenly now the player can now upgrade their armor further. The difference is that it's just a bit more organically integrated compared to Monster Hunter World. The developers implemented campaign thresholds on armor upgrading because they changed the way armor spheres work in Monster Hunter World. In previous titles, the player only needed one armor sphere to upgrade an armor by a single level. In Monster Hunter World, armor spheres are worth a different number of points. A regular armor sphere is worth 1 point, an armor sphere plus is worth 5 points, and so on. To upgrade armor, the player must stockpile these and spend them all at once. For this reason, the player doesn't actually need a higher rarity armor sphere, they just need a large number of lesser ones. I love the mental image of a hunter manually bringing 2,000 armor spheres and having the blacksmith fuse each and every one to one piece of armor, and then repeating this process 4 more times for all the other pieces of the armor. This is why they implemented the sudden upgrade cap removal thresholds, though I'm not sure why they made the change overall. Now we just have these extremely high numbers of armor spheres, which used to be accomplished with only one armor sphere. Armor spheres are just another example of streamlining, but it's caused armor upgrading to be arbitrary. It's essentially just a mandatory requirement to fully upgrade armor to max level as soon as it's available, because the game is balanced knowing the player can be at full defense at all times. Why doesn't the game just give the player the armor fully upgraded immediately, if the player can just upgrade it anyway? Monster Hunter 1 seems to be the only game that has this figured out. It's also interesting to note that the Palico equipment actually never gets upgraded. It has fixed defense upon creation. I appreciate Monster Hunter 2 DOS because upgrading armor is more complex. There's even times where it gives the player branching paths for the armor, similar to weapons. The player can choose the piece that gives them the skills they prefer, or what looks fashionable. The player can't always just upgrade every piece to max immediately. There's more thought put into every decision, as the materials to upgrade the armor are the same materials that are used for upgrading weapons. Look, I say I appreciate Monster Hunter 2 DOS's armor system, but I don't want to spin this game as being perfect. It isn't. The armor upgrade system, without there being campaign thresholds, seems really good in theory. This armor system benefits from the player mixing sets together and using different armor sets for different scenarios, so collecting many different armors is key, similar to Monster Hunter Rise. However, the game has extremely high expectations of what the player is able to accomplish, and expects an absurd number of difficult to acquire items. For example, I wish to face the Kirin, but my armor has low thunder defense. The best thunder defense armor aside from the Kirin armor is the Kezu armor. Alright, so I'll get some Kezu armor. The Kezu armor from Monster 2 DOS asks for not 1, not 2, but 3 pale bones, which is Kezu's rare carve, the 3% drop rate if captured and an 8% if the Kezu's back is broken. After many hours of attempting to grind Kezu, despite the game making it incredibly hard for me to grind, I was able to finally assemble the full set, which, by the way, like every armor in the game, gives the player basically nothing good, no real good active skills. I must now fully upgrade the armor. Of course, instead of armor spheres it calls for monster materials, and specifically it calls for a pickled Kezu whelp. What? Well, in Monster 2 DOS, the player gets an item that is essentially a pickling jar. After climbing the snowy mountains and receiving a Kezu whelp from mining here, I combined it with the pickling jar. Unfortunately, it doesn't even become a pickled Kezu whelp immediately. I have to place the item on the ground and wait 5 minutes of actual in-game time before the white smoke changes to pink, which means if I gather the item back, I'll now have a pickled Kezu whelp. All of this I had to research off of an online Japanese database because the game does not provide the player with any of this information. The player must do this 5 times, and it must be one at a time, and it must be during a quest against a large monster because again, there's no gathering quests. I returned to upgrade my armor using the pickled Kezu whelps, and I discovered that the further upgrades to the armor, the upgrades that allow me to have actual active armor skills, all require another pale bone. That's 5 more pale bones, on top of the 3 I needed for the armor set. No, attack! No! Are you kidding me? No. Cool, I didn't get it. That's real cool. Thank you, game. Wow, I did not get the thing I wanted. Game, why do you have to do this to me twice in one night? Yes! Thank you, game! Thank you. Thank you, game. Thank you so much. It's a common trend that Monster 2 DOS does not play to its strengths. While it can set new standards and pioneer the armor upgrade system and decoration system, it goes about it in the most grueling way possible. Of course, the developers would streamline this in Monster Portable 2nd, because it clearly needed some revising. However, they over-streamlined it, and has ultimately ruined armor upgrading altogether by making it mandatory yet effortless through the armor sphere system, thus making the whole system arbitrary to begin with. Again, why have an armor sphere system at all, if all the player was going to do was just upgrade the armor to its maximum defense immediately anyway? Alright, enough about equipment. This was the longest section of the video so far, but the next one is a doozy. So if you feel you need to take a break, I don't blame you. I have to tell you that writing this, it required a lot of research and many hours of Monster Hunter. So I really hope people watch this, and I really hope people share this, and actually listen to the things that are being said, and understand that the game that they're being sold by Capcom could be better. Anyway, there's still more! So, we're moving on. So, I've described Monster Hunter 2 DOS as archaic in comparison to newer titles. The game runs on inferior hardware, so the visuals and sounds are more compressed. The game absolutely looks like a PS2 game. When people say Monster Hunter Rise looks like a PS2 game, well, that's a compliment to PS2 games. The combat in this game is best described as clunky. Overall player movement is much more restricted. The game does not allow the player to cancel many of their character animations, so they are required to follow through with their decisions. It takes more time to chain certain attack animations together. Attack combos in modern titles flow together better. I could list a number of specifics for every weapon, but that would take an unnecessarily long amount of time in an already extremely long video. Actually, ironically, I'm about to list a large number of examples for another point, and I'm not ignorant to this irony. Monster Hunter 2 DOS also lacks many of the quality of life changes that the current titles carry. Like every video game series, the titles have experimented with different ideas and streamlined the game where necessary. So far, I've done my best to highlight that the series now streamlines the gameplay loop to benefit fast-paced boss fights above other elements, such as crop farming or hunter career simulation. Much of the streamlining has been subtle through what we call quality of life changes. I see this phrase passed around and it seems to be used equally for changes that impact the player experience without impacting the game balance, and changes that impact the game balance, which in turn would impact the player experience. These two subjects sound very similar, and there's a bunch of overlap obviously, but there is an importance in separating the two. Furthermore, the term player experience itself is rather loose. I could use the term immersion again, but I've already explained that it doesn't lend itself well in objective discussion. For this video, I want to define a quality of life change, what a quality of life change means, and I'm going to define it as only a change that impacts the player experience, and not the game balance. I want to evaluate many of what the community has called quality of life changes that separate Monster Hunter 2 DOS from Monster Hunter World. Anytime the quality of life change does not hit my criteria, and I have evidence that the change impacts game balance, I'll call it out for not being a true quality of life change, but rather a game mechanic change. By my definition, a quality of life change should improve the overall experience for the player without affecting the gameplay balance. I'm going to begin to list examples so this is easier to follow. Number 1. Combining items inside the item box, rather than pulling the items out and combining them in the item pouch. I mentioned this before. I consider this a quality of life change because it does not affect gameplay balance. The player can still craft items in their pouch if they wish, but it saves a few seconds of time overall. Logically, this makes sense. A player character should be able to craft items within the box as it's still within arm's reach. This makes the process overall less tedious for the player. Selecting a specific sum of combinations to craft at once rather than a single combination at a time. Also a quality of life change, very similar to the previous one. It also removes tedium. The process of crafting is still occurring, just at a faster rate. Instantaneous combinations the moment the player gathers an item like a herb or honey. Questionable, but overall it seems to be the same as the previous two examples. When the player gathers items with the intention to combine them, the game will combine them on the spot if it's safe to do so. This is a feature that the player can actually turn off if they'd like. It mostly just removes tedium. It can affect gameplay, such as gathering honey during a fight with a large monster and immediately getting a mega potion, though I would consider it a nitpick to actually call that completely game-changing, especially since in the old games you could just keep running around away from the monster and combine it in your pouch regardless. When you compare this to, well, using a Farcaster to restock an entire supply of items like you can in Monster Hunter World, yeah, I don't think this is a gameplay change. It's too contextual to be considered one. It's a quality of life change. Number 4. Combining items without the use of a book of combos or armor skill. This is a gameplay balance change, not a quality of life change. The game must be adjusted to account for the player to be able to craft any item flawlessly without any consequences. I theorize they added the combination assistant features in the original game to prevent players from crafting extremely helpful items when they first begin the game. It was likely also implemented to teach the player to prepare at the village, as this system requires the player to pull the book of combos out and take it out with them on every quest if they intend to combine out in the field. Likewise, in Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the player is required to pull out all of their books of combos into their item pouch anytime they combine items. I can see this as tedium being removed, but it also affects your supply levels when you're out in the field, how much space you have in your item pouch, and also it does cost money to buy these books of combos, so I call this an overall gameplay balance change. Now, on its own, the fourth change appears to be inconsequential on its own. It's just that when it becomes paired with the other 3 changes that I've already mentioned, it starts to have a heavier impact on the game overall. I feel this has become extremely inconsequential because in Monster Hunter World, the player can now just Farcaster back to the base and restock all their items at any point during the quest. I'm firm on this being a gameplay adjustment. It is rather minor, and personally I'm completely fine with being able to combine the items without the books, but that's up to the individual if you like this or not. The 4 changes I've listed so far were fundamental streamlining of the gameplay loop. Since crafting is essential for a successful hunt, it's smart to make this process less tedious without removing the actual process of crafting itself. I will still argue that the last one removes some importance of having a single item box where the player must do all their item management, but again, these changes are inconsequential compared to the million item box norm that you've entered in Generation 5. The next quality of life changes are a bit more controversial within the community. Number 5. Being able to evade roll backwards with your weapon drawn. If this was implemented into Monster Hunter 1, I do not see it affecting gameplay balance whatsoever. Anytime the player would have wanted to roll backwards, they would simply side evade or evade forwards, depending on the context. No matter what, in any Monster Hunter game, you have to be aware of what you're capable of doing, and you have to be positioned in a good spot, knowing that you can only evade in certain directions. I think I'm pretty firm on this. Evade roll backwards is a quality of life change. Number 6. The ability to cancel the use of consumable items, usually through evading. Again, if this was implemented during Monster Hunter 1, I don't see this affecting the game very much. If the player makes a mistake in consuming an item at the wrong moment and gets hit, the consumable isn't always used. If the player makes a mistake in consuming an item at the wrong moment and evades, the consumable isn't always used. It depends on timing and context, of course, but the player is still taught to be careful of timing of using items. Same goes for traps or bombs. I would consider this a quality of life change. The concept of deliberate action isn't greatly affected by the cancellation of using an item. Number 7. The ability to dash while using consumable items. Now we're getting into crazy territory. I would consider this a drastic gameplay balance change. And no, I'm not going to argue that this is negative or that it ruins deliberate action. The player must still be careful with their positioning and timing. The game is balanced around this. The reason they gave the player the ability to dash while consuming an item is to balance against the monster's different movement patterns in Generation 5. The player never had to dash while consuming an item in the old games because the monsters move more clunkily. Deliberate action with items is still here, it's just more involved than before. Number 8. When attacked, health depletion in the health bar is instantaneous. So this one might seem a little bit odd to some viewers, but this was actually a feature added in Monster Hunter 3. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, when the player is hit by a monster, their health bar would deplete with an animation, where the green slides down the bar to its new depleted position. I consider this a quality of life change. It's really inconsequential to the gameplay balance. It would be like half a second the player wouldn't be able to see where their health is. Personally, I'm very happy with this change. Number 9. The camera can be positioned inside walls. Throughout the Monster Hunter games, the camera has improved a lot. Many players on majority consider the camera to be improving. The camera no longer gets stuck on walls. And actually on that note, number 10, the implementation of a target camera. There's a target camera function that helps keep the camera focused on the monster, sort of like an auto cam, auto target. To me, this does not affect immersion, but it does affect the gameplay experience. Getting cornered by a monster in a fight isn't in the player's favor, regardless of which entry in the series. I have never had to use the target camera. I've trained myself to just constantly reposition the camera during combat. For this reason, I do not believe either of these camera changes affect gameplay balance. They are simply quality of life changes. I mean, like, if I'm still using the old system from the original game, and there's no real difference to how the game plays, yeah, I don't think that's a gameplay change. Number 11, small monsters stand back while the player is fighting a large monster. I made a point of this in part 5 of the video. This is a gameplay change, not a quality of life change. Monster 2 DOS is a very different experience. The game is built around the small monsters being a part of the fight. I've alluded to this before, but as the series has gone on, the importance of small monsters has been mitigated. Most players will agree it is less annoying to manage the small monsters alongside the large ones. But have any of you noticed that in their absence, monsters do more AoE attacks? The game is balanced differently now, plain and simple. Number 12. Holding down a button instead of tapping the button to gather items and carve monsters repeatedly. This is very clearly a quality of life change. It doesn't affect gameplay balance whatsoever, you just hold a button down, whatever. Number 13, instantaneous gathering of items. This is a gameplay change, but really only because it is coupled with the instantaneous crafting. It has a huge effect on bowgun ammo creation and potion supply levels. It streamlines receiving the supplies needed for the hunt. Actually, now that I think about it, this one might be up for debate. Number 14, in-game wiki on monsters, including carves, part breaks, and weaknesses. The game providing a wiki for the player is arguably a quality of life change. The older monster notes in the older games would usually refer to a monster ecology over advice on how to kill the monster. The downside to including these notes is that the game would need to be balanced to match the player's full understanding of monster weakness, and I believe it has affected the monster health to have been inflated. Even worse, the developers could adjust the game so if the player isn't playing to the monster's weaknesses, they will be doing essentially 0 damage. I could probably pull up some numbers to compare, like Monster Hunter 3 to Monster Hunter World, but honestly, the player could just as easily find these details on an online wiki via the internet, and I'm sure the games were balanced over the years with this in mind anyway. I'm sure the devs are aware that the players have probably data mined the games. To me, it breaks immersion when the game gives the player hunter all the monster weaknesses the moment the player discovers a previously undiscovered monster species. It's very unlikely the NPCs would be experts on the monster percentage data immediately after discovering it. And on that note, Number 15. Providing damage numbers when landing attacks. This is arguable. In older titles, one could somewhat determine how much damage they're dealing through how much blood was released from the monster upon landing an attack. Of course, this does not factor in weapon bounces, which most new players assume was a wasted attack. In truth, you're still doing damage on a bounced attack. Overall, damage numbers do an excellent job at teaching the player how different weapons function, and whether or not the player has taken advantage of a monster's weakness. Objectively, it encourages the players to experiment, and is ultimately more useful than the monster note charts. My subjective view on this is that it just removes immersion, and makes the game focus too much on DPS and high damage over just experiencing the game casually. Though this will be different from person to person. Furthermore, because damage numbers are optional and they can be turned off and you can still enjoy the game and play the game just fine without them on, I'll consider this a quality of life change, but again, it's arguable. Number 16. Providing whetstone sharpness on the HUD. Seeing your sharpness level is helpful. It does not affect the gameplay too much. Most players only sharpen when their level drops below their preferred spot anyway. It remains roughly the same even when the player can see the sharpness level, so I consider this a quality of life change. Number 17. Implementing a wishlist system for equipment at the blacksmith. It doesn't affect gameplay balance, and this should have been implemented in the first gen. The only, literally the equivalent in Gen 1 would be just writing it down on a piece of paper or something, so it's whatever. Number 18. Showing an entire weapon tree when upgrading or forging weapons. This is a quality of life change. This does not affect gameplay balance. The player would normally just use an online wiki via the internet, so this is far more straightforward and makes it easier to compare weapons. Number 19. Reversing weapon upgrades. This is also a quality of life change. It barely affects gameplay balance, though to play devil's advocate, it does push against the concept of deliberate action where every decision matters, and it's also arguable that is it even plausible in universe to reverse weapon upgrades? Like, how do the materials not get lost and consumed? I don't know. Number 20. Implementing a training area to practice with weapons. So, it makes no difference to the gameplay balance, and this could have been implemented in the first game. In a title like Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the players would partake in a quest to practice instead. Abandoning a quest really has no penalty, so it makes no difference if there was a training area or not. So I considered it a quality of life change overall. Number 21. Joining quests while they have already begun. Another quality of life change. If a player joins too late, they don't gain rewards. It's fairly balanced and doesn't change the experience very much. It's not much different from being carried by better players in previous titles. Though they changed it in Rise, you can still gain the rewards even if you join late. Number 22. There is no longer a separation between online and offline quests in World. I consider this a drastic gameplay change. In the older titles, offline quests were balanced for single player, while online quests were balanced for multiplayer. In World, the quests were balanced to be completable, but many of the higher difficulty quests were catered more to be completed with a group. This one's open to debate. Let me know what you think about this one. I consider it a gameplay change. In Monster Hunter Rise, they went back to the old system. Yeah, I guess they prefer the old system. Alright, and finally, number 23, it's a big one. The removal of paintballs. Now, there are many players who do not like the paintball system. On the immersion side of the argument, my subjective side of the argument, scout flies, are more interesting as a tracking concept. World allows the player to gather physical tracks of the monsters and to follow the monster that way. On the gameplay side of the argument, Scoutflies assist the player in navigation, since the maps in World are extremely complex compared to older titles. They also bring the player to the monster quicker, and it's more streamlined than the paintball system was. In Monster 2 Dos, it is extremely tedious to find the monsters on a map. They stay in a zone for a period of, 10 seconds before they start flying away. The drones will circle a map within a minute. The player is not provided with anything tangible to track, like footprints. The game usually requires the player to just run in circles looking for the monster. Other options include waving at a hot air balloon, which will provide the monster's location. It should be noted that the game never tells the player that this is a trick that they can do, they kind of just have to tell each other. Or the player could also use the Psycho Serum, or they can use the armor skill that lets you see the monster on the map. In the end, the player is simply given a marker on the map and then they must follow that marker. There are two other notable methods to attract a monster. By playing a hunting flute, the monster may fly to the zone it's played in. This seems far more efficient than circling the map over and over, and I've done it a couple times. Also, placing down raw meat apparently attracts monsters to that location, though I've never pulled this off. The game instruction manual for Monster Hunter 1 says it's possible, so I'm believing it, but maybe that's a lie? I don't know. I theorize that the game was designed this way to encourage online play. With 4 players, the player could split up and find the monster faster. This is why there's a signal function. Interestingly, the signal function is still in Monster Hunter World, but I've found personally it was rarely used among players, aside from when it is automatically deployed when the player spots the monster. Another example of streamlining the experience so that the player doesn't have to worry about anything except attacking the monster. I believe that Chameleos was designed to counter the player's typical method of tracking monsters in Generation 1 and 2. Usually a player relies on their sight to find the monster. Chameleos is a monster that is usually always completely invisible. This requires the player to instead use their hearing to search for the monster. I found in Monster 2 Dos that hearing is sometimes just as vital, especially when it rains in the jungle. The trees obscure the player's vision, and the rain obscures hearing. The player needs to stop moving and really focus their senses. I really like that immersion aspect, but that's subjective. In Generation 3 and 4, they extended the period of time the monsters stayed in each zone. The new strategy became memorizing the initial spawn point of the monster and dashing to that zone at the start of the quest before it begins to move. Tracking becomes obsolete once the player memorizes it. This is why Scoutflies are an interesting and fresh revision of the concept. Eventually, however, once the player has fought the monster enough times, they no longer have to collect tracks and it'll be marked on the map instantaneously. I guess this is fine because it's expected most players would simply memorize the monster's starting location because they would have been grinding the monster anyway to get to that point. And I mean, the game wants you to grind every monster anyway. And I do admit, the Scoutfly system is not perfect. Monster Hunter World's maps are convoluted messes, and at times I feel like the Scoutflies were implemented more just to assist the player with navigation rather than tracking the monster. I believe a good balance between these two systems is possible. The monster tracking has been in the series since the beginning, and it can still be improved. Scoutflies are a wonderful step in the right direction, not perfect, but I'm looking forward to see what they have in store for the next title. Oh, right, in Monster Hunter Rise, the monsters are already marked on the map regardless. No matter what, at all times. Well, it's to be expected. Capcom would rather remove features than find better solutions for them. To me, the ideal solution is to keep the monster's position on the map a complete mystery until the player has spotted the monster. Then the monster will remain permanently on the map until it's defeated. The player would simply be required to start the hunt by using a vantage point and binoculars to spot the monster, or memorize the spawning locations. I'd love to see a Monster Hunter game that spawns a monster like the intro cutscene of the original game. You wait by a river for Raphalos to swoop down and attack the Aptonoff. From there, the hunt begins. Just an idea. I spent the time to go over many of the gameplay changes and quality of life changes in this section to highlight that just because a game is different now, it doesn't mean that it's bad, or bad game design. Rather, we should acknowledge that for the most part, for the most of these change is good. And a lot of these changes don't actually affect gameplay balance or immersion, they really just improve the player experience. I'm using this section to juxtapose most of what I've discussed in the previous sections, which I hope don't come off as negative, but I feel like they are negative. I'm attempting to prove that Monster Hunter as a series overall is focused on streamlining the gameplay loop for DPS boss fights. Many of the changes that affect the hunting itself are positive and largely appreciated by the community at large. Many will agree that without hunting monsters, it won't be Monster Hunter, so obviously prioritizing hunting monsters is encouraged. The issue is that we haven't had a true Monster Hunter game in so many years, and it's just been normalized to this Monster Hunter portable formula that I feel like the community as a whole has forgotten what it means to be a true Monster Hunter game in the first place. I've seen many people use the quality of life changes as an argument, saying that the older games are better, and I want to say that this is not the correct argument to have. The older games aren't better because the hunting is better. The hunting has progressively gotten better over the titles, I hope I've proved that. The older games are perceived better by veteran fans because there is more to the game's experience than just DPS boss fights. Streamlining the experience is one thing, but removing features altogether is removing a part of the experience. The importance on certain actions performed in the game are lost because they've been streamlined into just oblivion, as I've said before. The paintball and scoutfly systems are an excellent example of this, because they're just gone now. By definition, hunting means to pursue and kill. You can look this up. Hunting is to pursue and kill. By removing the pursuing, we're now only killing. This isn't Monster Killer, this is Monster Hunter. I fear that other systems will eventually be streamlined into oblivion. Take, for example, the whetstone. And I know this is an extreme example, and I've used it in a previous video, but take, for example, the whetstone. In Monster Hunter World, the whetstone is a permanent addition to the player item pouch and is now infinite use, similar to the pickaxe. These are also quality of life changes. The whetstones were implemented into the original game to prevent the player from hitting the monster too much. It's to prevent DPS, and to have the player be conscious about their hits. I didn't explore sharpness skills when I discussed all the attack boost skills, however there are many skills that abuse weapon sharpness levels to negate the whetstone's purpose. In Monster Hunter World Iceborne, there are builds that utilize Teostra's technique, a skill that prevents weapon sharpness from dropping when landing critical hits. Coupling this with the affinity boosting skills, it is entirely possible to negate weapon sharpness drops altogether, negating the need for a whetstone entirely. Is it really crazy to fear that eventually Capcom may remove whetstones from the game entirely? Because they're already negating the need for it using the skills. That's why I think it's a perfectly reasonable fear, and while I don't think Capcom will actually do it, it makes you wonder, well, if they keep prioritizing DPS, what level will they actually go to? I found the way that Capcom advertises Monster Hunter games is actually quite similar to advertising fighting games. They reveal the monsters one by one, every single new monster through the trailers. They'll even put their names on the screen like they're fighters from a fighting game roster. By the time you play the game, you already know every monster in the game. Nothing is a mystery. It's all in the open, and it's very much highlighted. I believe this plays into their design philosophy. They advertise the boss fights the player will engage in. They're rewriting Monster Hunter's gameplay loop as a fantasy boss fight game, not a fantasy hunting simulation game. Part 8 of this video is an evaluation of Monster Hunter 2 DOS as a piece of art, separate from my previous discussions which involved game design and player choice. The discussion of art can be objective, but the ultimate point of analyzing art is to extrapolate greater meaning than what is objectively presented, or at least that's how I feel. These greater meanings are typically reached through subjective understanding of the art, so basically what it means to the individual, what the individual pulls from that piece of art. Unfortunately, video games are an art form that requires the individual to directly interact with the art itself, and this leads to vastly different experiences between different individual players. As such, this section will be full of my subjective experiences and takeaways from Monster 2 DOS. I'm including this subjective discussion of Monster 2 DOS as a piece of art, because this video is also supposed to be a review. An analysis of the game's aesthetics and personal player experience is typically found in a game review. I'm going to first discuss the objective presentation of the aesthetics within the game, including the visuals, audio, and text, then discuss the apparent narrative story that the game presents. At that point, it'll be more subjective. In these discussions, I'll compare the artistic intention of Monster 2 DOS to Monster Hunter World and a little bit of Monster Hunter Rise. I hope to present why I believe, despite the limitations of the game, Monster 2 DOS provides a richer, more valuable, and more intelligent narrative than the newer titles do, though this is inherently an opinion and not a fact. This section was saved to last because it holds the least amount of weight in this discussion. Honestly, we should view this section of the video as a bonus and not essential to my thesis whatsoever. However, I do have a lot of strong thoughts on the narrative of these games, and I still think that they are valuable to discuss regardless. Alright, so let's just talk about the aesthetics and narrative presented in Monster 2 DOS. The title screen, let's just start at the title screen, is akin to a tabletop with assorted wooden objects and archaic paper acting as the menu. This is a huge contrast to the menus found in the other Monster Hunter titles, which are built to look more like simple digital displays with the logo behind it. Monster 2 DOS's physical style menu incorporates Monster Hunter's in-universe culture and technology, delivering, in my opinion, a down-to-earth and comfy aesthetic. Many other in-game menus match this aesthetic, and this has been used here and there in other Monster Hunter games. I have personally enjoyed this aesthetic because it acts as a literal presentation of the art and culture of the game's universe. Monster Hunter World allows the player to choose quests off of paper as well, and in Monster Hunter Rise you can see stylized paintings of the monsters, so this aesthetic is present in newer titles as well. Monster 2 DOS has a unique aesthetic overall. It seems more archaic with the structures and technology compared to the current games, though I'm sure that could be argued. The in-game visuals, primarily the textures and models, are of lower quality, rather very low quality for 2006, though that is an opinion. The game's environment do look nicer on the PS2 compared to how they look on the PSP in Monster Hunter Portable 2nd, but the hardware power, or perhaps my emulator, struggles to deliver these environments at higher fidelity. The fog effects in the swamp are much better in the original Monster Hunter 2 DOS. Every Monster Hunter title prior to Monster Hunter World would make use of full motion videos to deliver extra context about the Monster Hunter universe. I've mentioned this before. These fully rendered cutscenes provide the player with information regarding the society and characters that the game would struggle with delivering due to limitations with the hardware and the limited turnaround time with each new title. I mean, they make a new Monster Hunter every, year. Monster Hunter World ditched these and made use of the in-game engine to deliver all of the cutscenes. Monster Hunter World's cutscenes are scripted segments that relate directly to the narrative the game is presenting. Usually the cutscenes are from the perspective of the player hunter interacting with the handler, or other members of the guild, or the monsters themselves. These cutscenes rarely expand outside of the player hunter's direct actions. In the older generations, the pre-rendered videos included ecology videos of the monsters, which would show activities of the monsters that the game would otherwise not be capable of showing. These older videos also include many moments that are completely separated from the player hunter. The intro cinematics represent the world itself, not the player actions. I find that this delivery of information may help the player gain a greater understanding of the overall universe, rather than the more direct and personal story as it is in Monster Hunter World, though these are just different methods of storytelling in the end. Monster Hunter was known for telling its narrative through subtext, and used its unique atmosphere and in-universe society to deliver that subtext. I personally believe before Monster Hunter World, this subtextual delivery of information was always done rather well, though that is up to your own opinion. I played Monster 2 DOS in limited English. It wasn't fully translated, so I could not understand what any of the characters were saying. However, I still appreciated the moments when they interacted with me, and I could grasp a bit of understanding from the cutscenes and the fully rendered video. I don't need the handler to tell me that she's the hunter's handler just by saying it. The game does a good job of delivering it visually. I personally find that Monster Hunter World suffers because it never uses these characters to branch out and do anything beyond what they've been signed up to do at the start of the game. Juxtapose this with a cinematic of the Jumbo Village leader traveling across the world and settling a new village. It's quick, simple, and I learned so much about this character without a single English word being spoken. The music for Monster 2 DOS is special, because many of the music tracks written for this game didn't return in Monster Hunter Portable 2nd, and the music that did return eventually got replaced in Monster Hunter Portable 2nd G with songs from Frontier. For example, the battle background music written for the different hunting environments in Monster 2 DOS were replaced by the equivalent songs that were written for Monster Hunter Frontier. This is the original Tower of Battle theme from Monster 2 DOS. And this is the Tower Battle theme from Frontier. The Monster Hunter Frontier songs continue to be reused in Monster Hunter 3G, Monster Hunter 4, and even Monster Hunter Cross. Despite these songs being from Frontier, I never understood this. Dondorma Town returned in Monster Hunter 4G, but they wrote new background music for the main market area, so it's not the same. I wonder why Capcom is actively trying to avoid the original songs they made for Monster 2 DOS. The main theme of Monster 2 DOS, translated as Hunter Go Forth, though I'm sure there's other translations out there, is a motif that is used many times throughout the game. It completely replaced the original Monster Hunter main theme, Proof of a Hero, in this game. The Proof of a Hero motif is heard, but it's incredibly rare to hear it in this game. Ironically, as the series has continued, the Hunter Go Forth motif has become rare to hear. In Monster Hunter World, we do hear it when we fight the Kashela Diora, but that's about it. I personally believe that Monster 2 DOS is the game where Monster Hunter found its voice. Although many of the songs use stock sample loops, it makes up for it in its creative expression of the sampled sound. The varied and expressive nature of the soundtrack delivers a sound that is difficult to place solely on one cultural influence. It's got a wonderfully worldly vibe that will take you from the Middle East all the way through to Asia and into Japan. It's very different from Monster Hunter 1's more European sounds. This soundtrack has stuck with me and is probably my favorite soundtrack of all time, but I mean it's hard because I also love 3 and I also love 4's soundtrack. A great example for Monster 2 DOS of a good song was Lunastra's theme, I'd translated it as Empress of a Blazing Kingdom. Lunastra is the final boss of Monster 2 DOS before the credits roll, and it has a unique Eastern percussion sound mixed with the Western brass and strings. It begins with a powerful use of percussion, a strong introduction to this powerful monster, and then as the battle continues, the brass and strings are given more focus, to complement the player's struggle and victory against the Empress of the Ancient Tower. Because this song was also used for Teostra, the song is now more commonly known as the Teostra theme. I do not know if it was written and intended to be for both monsters or just one. That we'll have to ask Capcom directly. In Monster Hunter World, they wrote a new song for Teostra, the Ruler of the Flame song. This song has grown on me, though I was quite disappointed by the suppression of the percussion. I truly feel its voice was lost. Although this is just an opinion. I know many were okay with this song. This is not in the script, but I wanted to say that I absolutely love the Teostra theme in Monster Hunter Rise, and I think that it's perfect, and they actually brought its voice back. So I'm very glad that the Monster Hunter Rise team delivered a song that really fits the themes of the Emperor and Empress of Flames. Anyway, back to Monster Hunter World, they also brought back Lunastra, and frankly I find Lunastra's new theme, Empress of the Flame, to be insulting, and a complete misrepresentation of the character of Lunastra. The song is just Teostra's song, but they added a harp and a female choir. Capcom, Lunastra is not just female Teostra. Lunastra was the final boss of Monster Hunter 2 DOS. This song feels like a complete lack of understanding of this monster and what made her a unique fight. I'm using this to segue into the narrative presented in Monster Hunter 2 DOS, particularly the ending, the final battle against Lunastra on the ancient tower. The tower is without a doubt intended to be a representation of the Tower of Babel. The game itself has a lance that references the tower called Babel, which implies Capcom is well aware of the story. Jumbo Village, the jungle, and the desert can be argued as having a Middle Eastern influence. I argue that Monster 2 DOS is built around a vaguely subtropical Eastern influence overall. Although there are some parts, like with the mountain and Blangunga and Blangunga's armor, where it kind of goes more into that, I don't know, Tibetan sort of Himalayan sort of look. I'm not an expert on it, but I can see the influence. Rajang is a wonderful monster. He has a lot of influences. One of his influences is a minotaur. I feel like one of his least important influences is a monkey, despite the fact that newer Monster Hunter tends to advertise him as a monkey. Lunastra and Teostra are supposed to be manticores. I have personally come to believe that Lunastra and Teostra may also be based off of the Babylonian winged lions. The depictions of winged lions that are found in the ruins of the ancient civilization of Babylon. Again, referencing the tower. Despite not being able to read most of the Japanese text in Monster 2 DOS, there is enough context clues that reveal that the ancient tower had to have been built by an ancient powerful civilization, as it is ruined and no people are presently living within the tower, nor does any of the currently living NPCs have the capabilities or technology to recreate the tower. The tower is a symbol of something that no longer exists. When you mine at the tower, you gain Kashela Daora scales, providing the subtext, context, to believe that the tower itself is made from Kashela Daora bodies, which is the flagship monster of Monster Hunter 2 DOS. The fight against Kashela Daora is stretched over 3 separate hunts in 3 separate environments. This is a difficult and long fight. After defeating this monster, the game shows the player a tower built out of their dead bodies. The tower is a symbol of a civilization that hunted the monsters to oblivion. The legendary Elder Dragon isn't so legendary anymore, it's just endangered. Despite the mighty civilization, managing to slay tens of thousands of these dragons to build a tower out of them, the civilization is now dead and gone. Their victory was fleeting, and their symbol of their power and accomplishments is now the home of Lunastra. Ultimately, the game is indirectly telling the player that their triumph over the monsters are not an achievement, and even if you slay 1,000 or 10,000 of these Kashela Daoras, the player will eventually die. You can try and triumph over nature, you can try and triumph over God, but in the end, nature will kill you. You will die. What does the hunter gain from grinding the same monster over and over again? It's so strange that a series that celebrates the grinding gameplay loop as just a silly video game without any consequences would include such a massive subtextual message about the entire activity the game advertises itself to, celebrate, all being futile and fleeting, like a hollow victory. Overall, interesting, different, subtle. Over a decade later, I wonder what Capcom can do with their storytelling in a massive AAA-style game. How much have they expanded in their storytelling when it comes to Monster Hunter World? What is Monster Hunter World's narrative?
Sisters and brothers of the Fifth Fleet, it's time. I'll keep my farewell brief.
Now, I've replayed Monster Hunter World in full multiple times, and every new file, it makes me laugh at this opening. It sets up the Admiral as this important man, only for him to come off as an irresponsible buffoon if you actually play the game. Monster Hunter World attempts to simulate a military operation instead of the village concept that was in all the other Monster Hunter games. The story follows an army of elite soldiers, an army. Then they are colonizing a new world. It's really bizarre that they created a game that celebrates the colonization period of human history. The destruction of native culture and peoples is a pain that is still felt hundreds of years later. Whether it be Africa, Australia, or the Americas, colonization is considered in retrospect as an unfortunate mistake that we must live with and learn from. Monster Hunter World's reasoning for colonization is rooted in the Elder Crossing, which essentially a group of scientists desire to know the reason why elder dragons flock to another continent every decade. I do not understand how solving the Elder Crossing is at all beneficial for the overall well-being of the people in the Monster Hunter universe. They typically don't like elder dragons, and if the elder dragons are leaving their continent to go somewhere else, Why do they even care? How does this group of scientists manage to convince the hunting guild to waste an absorbent amount of money to send multiple armies to colonize the New World, all to solve this mystery that has no bearing on their well-being? I can only theorize that it is simply a front for colonization, which would be funded by the established kingdoms within the Monster Hunter world. As Monster Hunter continued to expand as a series, it was developing some kind of Pokemon syndrome where everything in the universe is tied to hunting monsters. The guild has its hands in everything, and I don't see how animal hunting could run the entire world. Monster Hunter makes no effort to expand or explain any of this outside of Monster Hunter stories, and that's quite unfortunate. El Dorado refers to the semi-mythical ruler or kingdom of gold that was sought by the Spanish colonizers in the 16th century. The Spanish colonizers were propelled by rumors of a man covered in gold, with a half-baked promise that there would be some land of gold amongst the native South Americans. This led to conquests by the Spanish into deeper parts of South America, colonizing and conquering the local South Americans. This is all information I got from Wikipedia, just a simple Google search. So why, Capcom? Why did you name this map after El Dorado? If not only to cement the comparison to the era of colonization. Despite the story of El Dorado's search being tied to battle and destruction at the expense of the native South American peoples, Capcom insisted that their story of the unnecessary slaying of Kulve Taroth is a positive and celebratory event. Just like the Spanish colonizers, the guild sends in hunters to senselessly kill the native life just to get some gold. Like every quest in Monster Hunter World and Iceborne, there is not sufficient reasoning to be hunting the native animals on the New World. The guild, frankly, should not be in the New World because they have no good reason to be there. The monsters are barely in the guild's way, and if they are, it's because the guild is imposing on their territory. The slaying of any of these monsters seems completely unnecessary because no village or town is ever in danger. The guild shouldn't be there to begin with. In this game, every time the player captures a monster, allowing for a non-lethal victory, the monster becomes available to be hunted again in an arena. Despite the scientists claiming that they are studying these monsters and respecting them, they throw them into an arena for you to slaughter when you're done researching it. Over the course of Monster Hunter World, the player, hunter, and handler solve the Elder Crossing. And they solve it all by themselves, basically. Despite the guild not solving this mystery with all their people, all their time, money, and effort that they had over the past 40 years.
Yes. It only took 40 years.
I don't understand how everyone in this game is so brain dead and bloodthirsty. When Zora Magdaros is preparing to die in the Everstream, the guild gives the army a choice between packing up and leaving or repelling the monster. They insist on staying, leading to this massive operation. Nergigante shows up and wishes to eat Zora Magdaros. The guild tries to kill Nergigante despite it having the potential to help them in their effort. Capcom did not even make an attempt to have Nergigante, write it in so that he would be helping them. Don't know why. The guild insists the player must then kill Nergigante despite it being a natural deterrent to Elder Dragons. After killing Nergigante, more Elder Dragons show up. Big surprise! After killing those Elder Dragons, even though the Elder Crossing provides the context that they were likely going there to die anyway, the player hunter is tasked to fight Xeno'jiiva. Why? Is it threatening the guild's operation? When Xeno'jiiva grows into Safi'jiiva, it doesn't attack the guild at all. Despite this, the guild still insists the player hunter kill Safi'jiiva. Despite solving the Elder Crossing and killing one of every species living in the New World, the guild refuses to send everyone home, and the characters continue to live in their bizarre boat town. These characters all have family back home, so why don't they go home? The game's plot is recycled in Iceborne. There's a new story regarding a mysterious migration of Legiana. This is tied to another Elder Dragon known as Shara Ishvalda, which is also minding its own business and not really affecting the guild. Why doesn't the guild just leave? When the player hunter is incapable of defeating Shara Ishvalda, another Nergigante, or maybe the same Nergigante? I don't know, appears and kills Shara Ishvalda, assisting the player hunter and the guild in their effort. Immediately following this, the player hunter is tasked with tracking and killing that Nergigante. Nergigante even assists the player again against an attacking Basilgeuse, yet the player is still tasked with killing Nergigante. The entire operation in the New World is supposed to be led by the Admiral, but instead he's off jerking off in the forest somewhere while the entire army just bums around killing animals.
Some of them are huge. How do they form?
Beats the heck out of me.
Why was this man hired? Why was this man given this responsibility? Why do any of the other characters give him any respect? Why is there even a currency system or money exchanged at all? If the entire operation is being funded by the guild, shouldn't everything just be paid for? Since when do soldiers have to pay for their food when they're overseas? How is this military capable of functioning without the player avatar? Theoretically, the player's involvement should not have any bearing on the success of this military operation of the Fifth Fleet, right? There are a large number of seemingly capable hunters in the Fifth Fleet, including an ace hunter and the huntsman, the admiral, this guy, this woman. Meanwhile, the player hunter, on their own, manages to take down the Teostra, Lunastra, Kashela, Valhazak, twice, Nergigante, twice, honestly like 3 times, Velkhana, Xenojiva, Namiel, and an Elatrion. Whether or not the player actually does these hunts solo or not, they are responsible for succeeding in these incredibly difficult fights, without much involvement from the entire rest of the military. The handler always says, it was a team effort. It usually wasn't. Shouldn't they send an entire army to kill Elatrion? Why are they only sending your character? Why are they trying to kill Elatrion? Why is Elatrion even here? Isn't he just there to die? Isn't that why the Elder Crossing happens? Why does a second Elatrion show up when Fatalis is messing around in the New World? That's an entire ocean away. Why do they insist the player must go and fight Elatrion again? It's not doing anything. It's just expected at this point that if the moment the guild just happens to find an Elder Dragon living the rest of its days in retirement, the Elder's Recess, they just send the player to go and kill it. Like, I really need to ask, do any of the players honestly find this story to be reasonable or okay? Like, frankly, this is awful. These characters are batshit insane. Like, honestly, what the fuck is going on?
Bioenergy. Lurking so close, yet hiding so well.
You know what's funny? When you read the page, The Hunters Guild, on, like, the Monster Hunter Wiki, like the fandom Wikia, none of the lore is properly reflected within the actual game. Does Capcom understand invasive species? Like, frankly, do they understand what an invasive species is? That's a species that is in a location that they do not belong and thus disrupt the local environment. The monsters aren't invading territories they don't belong to. They are moving as they've always done for thousands or millions of years. The only true invasive species is humans. They are the ones that disrupt the environment and senselessly kill everything in sight. It is clear that Capcom makes zero effort to actually critically analyze their story beyond, is this fun to play? And is this a good enough reason to kill this animal? Have any of you actually read the quest details in World? Majority of them are from the head ecologist, and it's honestly insulting. There's barely any solid reasoning for killing any of these monsters. The one for the Rathalos is just awful. They basically are just making a joke that, oh, we gotta grind. You know, we already killed 10 of them, we gotta kill 11th. Oh well.
Interesting. Where'd you get him?
You know where you drove off, Big Ugly? Well, there's a spot further in there. And it's just loaded with these things.
They're incredible. It's like there's this energy pulsing.
What is the
inside.
Everstream? Is it connected to Elder Dragon energy? The dragon element? It's never really explained beyond bioenergy. In the Monster Hunter universe, bioenergy can grow into crystals, apparently. How come in the Wyvern's End in Monster Hunter Cross there's no crystals? How come in the Frost Islands in Monster Hunter Rise there's no crystals? The Rotten Veil is a thinly veiled reference to Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. At least I believe. Though Monster Hunter World seemed to completely miss Nausicaa's message about pro-environment. Oops! Epic shallow reference, Capcom.
Look, it's raining life.
There's clearly an attempt being made to simulate a feeling of belonging amongst the Fifth Fleet. I've seen online that many players felt the relationship between the handler and the player really disingenuous, or at the very least, many people found her annoying. On the flip side, I have not personally experienced any player complain about the quest receptionist in the previous titles. Fans love the Guild Marm, and all of her dialogue was just through text. Players seem to really love the twins in Monster Hunter Rise, and they barely do anything. After 12 years, one would think that the developers of Capcom would be able to prepare a better relationship between the player and these characters beyond just walking and talking. It sucks that the most intimate situation that they're in is just talking. Going back to Monster 2 DOS for a second, it attempts to simulate a believable village hunter dependency. This dependency I find to be quite intimate. The player is the only person who can partake in the quests for the village. The more the player assists with the requests of villagers, the village will upgrade. The village appreciates the player's effort. I like the moments where a villager will ask to have lunch with the player, thanking the player for their hard work. The player can even partake in a drinking minigame with a Vivarian lady sent from the guild. The game is doing its absolute best to build friendship among these characters while being a PS2 game without really, frankly, any story. If an NPC wishes to eat a meal with the player, it's because the player has been going out of their way to specifically help that personal NPC's requests. This is the NPC's AI responding to the player's actions to go have lunch with you. That's really nice. In Monster Hunter World, the only time the player sits down with the NPCs to eat is through a scripted cutscene. It's not the same intimacy as we get in Monster Hunter 2 DOS. All the NPCs in Monster Hunter World ever talk about is killing animals and colonizing the land. The point I'm making is that there is a disconnect between the player's actions having a direct impact on the local environment versus the local environment having a direct impact on the player's actions. This is an experience that's been lost, and I fear it'll never return in later Monster Hunter titles. I have to include a bit of discussion on Monster Hunter Rise to further expand my point. But obviously Monster Hunter Rise is not finished yet, at least at the time of this recording, so I don't really know how the story ends. The expeditions in Monster Hunter Rise are essentially endless free hunting, although this time the player can continually hunt monsters endlessly and be greeted with a massive reward screen at the end. With the ability to restock on supplies through the camp and no consequences for fainting or a time limit, this is a leisurely way to simulate living off the land and hunting freely. Surface level, this seems to be like an improved version of the free hunting in previous titles. In Monster Hunter 3 Tri, the rewards you gained from free hunting in Moga Woods were specific commodities used for trade, farming, and fishing. These items were tied to an implied relationship between the hunter and the village. The direct actions of the player hunting for the village gave the village specific goods that were otherwise they couldn't get themselves. None of the villagers are trained hunters. Because the larger and more dangerous monsters were encroaching on Moga Village's border and livelihood, the hunter is given sufficient reason to kill these animals, save the village, and allow them to grow and function better. It is a very direct and intimate connection between the player and the village because the player must manually transfer these commodities themselves. In Monster Hunter World, if the characters request the player kill a Paolumu to help this airship move, the player does not actually have to deliver the materials, it is automatic. I'm focusing on free hunting because in my opinion it helps deliver a more nuanced experience of player-hunter environment symbiosis than the current quest system does. The free hunting system from Monster Hunter 3 Tri and the season day modifier system in Monster Hunter 2 DOS create an experience unique to each game, and I truly believe they help deliver a stronger, more thoughtful experience to the player. I'm glad that in Monster Hunter Rise the player will receive many monster materials for their efforts in free hunting. However, because their hunting has no direct impact on Kamura Village, it kinda loses its point altogether. It's no longer a strong bond between the player and the environment, it's just another way to grind the DPS boss fights. I guess overall, I'm thankful Monster Hunter Rise doesn't glorify colonization, because it's just embarrassing. The American viewers should know about this. I'm not American, I'm Canadian, but I was taught the same thing in school. Do you guys remember when 30 million bison, buffalo, roamed the Great Plains of North America? Remember when the colonizers from Europe came in and killed them all? Even if you create a tower, a symbol of your accomplishment of killing millions of the same animal, you will die, eventually. You cannot triumph over nature, because nature eventually will kill you. I thought this was the message of Monster Hunter. And this is why, to generate a stronger narrative, I really do think that Monster Hunter either needs to be self-aware and subtextually teaching the player that senseless killing is wrong, or maybe go harder on the survival aspect and create an experience where the player truly is in danger and must kill the animal to survive. The game is Monster Hunter. The player is a monster hunter. They should never remove the ability to hunt monsters, but they can at least try to make this experience a message about the symbiotic relationship between people, animals, the environment, and nature itself. There's a difference between hunting a monster and killing it for sport. Killing for the fast speedrun time! The game experience is currently built to benefit the latter, to make hunting as fast as possible, to make an action game. And it's just been flavored with these shameful and insulting attempts to create any kind of honest or thoughtful experience with a greater message. Even after everything is said and done, is Monster 2 DOS worth playing? Well, if you're a die-hard Monster Hunter fan, then I absolutely implore you to try out the other older Monster Hunter titles. Monster Hunter Portable 2nd G is the best functional game out of the first 2 generations. If you're a masochist, then yeah, you should play Monster 2 DOS. It's probably the most difficult video game I've ever played. I cannot stress enough that even after beating Alatreon and Iceborne, I cannot seem to defeat a low-rank Azure Rathalos in DOS. This game is brutal and is constantly working against you to make this a grueling and tedious experience. Without any online multiplayer servers available, you get no assistance. It's all on your own. Only attempt this game if you have like at least 1,000 hours in Monster Hunter Portable 2nd G, or Freedom Unite as they call it in the States. Your skills in Monster Hunter World, they just won't do much here. This video was made to explore how Monster Hunter's changed, and more specifically how different Monster Hunter 2 DOS is. It's true, Monster Hunter 2 DOS in particular provides a unique experience not found in any other title in the series, and should be recognized as the last true survival simulation Monster Hunter title. It should also be acknowledged as a pioneer of many features that are mainstays in the current series, including armor upgrades, the decoration system, time of day cycles, and a plethora of amazing monsters, amazing music, amazing characters, and everything. However, Monster Hunter 2 DOS is also extremely frustrating to play. I find the controls and the camera are always working against me. The other quality of life changes found in the titles that followed this game are certainly missed. But the game isn't unplayable. Not like Monster Hunter 1, that game is actually unplayable. Monster Hunter 2 DOS is a complete game and a worthwhile experience to try, it's just really difficult to play. I remember reading a tweet, I think it was from Gaijin Hunter once, that basically said, Monster Hunter hasn't gotten easier, you've gotten better. And no, that's not true! The game is much easier to play now. The camera is smooth, the controls are even smoother, the player animations are faster, the combos are easier to string together, the hitboxes are tighter, the game gives the player more free supplies, the game provides more tutorials, the player isn't required to constantly manage their inventory, they're not hindered by the time of day or season, they don't have to worry about the small monsters, they don't have to worry about the pickaxes breaking, the game provides offline assistance in the form of the felines or the palamutes which automatically heal the player, buff the player, manage the small monsters for the player, attack the monster and deal damage. There's so many examples. I can face a Yen Kutku in Monster Hunter 4, and it's the easiest thing. But a Yen Kutku in Monster Hunter 2 DOS takes precision and critical thinking. It's hard. In Monster Hunter 2 DOS, the Gravios took everything I had to defeat. It was a very long and aggravating fight. In Monster Hunter 4, it was no problem. Done. Easy. 10 minute, not even 10 minute, like, easy. Fast. Hitboxes are tighter. To counter this, there's more endgame monsters that use one-hit KO AoE attacks. I'm looking at you, Alatreon. Armor defense is higher. To counter this, they've bloated monster attack values. Monster Hunter has gotten easier. To counter this, they've bloated damage and health numbers. To counter this, the endgame monsters are even more extremely difficult than they've ever been before. When we say Monster Hunter has gotten easier, it's a nuanced answer. Obviously, the endgame of Iceborne isn't easy. Obviously, it's difficult. We cannot deny, however, that the challenge imposed by low rank has gotten significantly easier because it has, and anyone who's played all these games would see it. I've spent over 80 hours in Monster 2 DOS, and I'm still only playing low rank offline, because that's all there is available. Quest list is very small, but that doesn't mean that the content is any less. The last time I played through low rank in Monster Hunter World, I was using the free DLC Defender equipment that the game gives the player immediately starting the game. I didn't understand that this equipment turned the game into easy mode. I flew through low rank like it wasn't even an issue. This is such a disingenuous tactic. Capcom made the base game of Monster Hunter World stupid easy so the players would fly through it and ideally purchase Iceborne. Juxtaposing this to Monster Hunter 2 DOS, it makes me appreciate the effort that went into making this game's content last. Playing Monster Hunter 2 DOS reminded me of when I played Monster Hunter 3 Try, for the first time all those years ago. Bottom line though, this Monster 2 DOS is still incredibly satisfying to play, regardless of the high difficulty or frustrating archaic design. Monster 2 DOS had me experiment with weapons outside of my comfort zone. I like Lance now. I'm a Lance user. That was never a thing before. Monster 2 DOS, doesn't make me worry about dealing massive damage or DPS, but rather to be precise and careful of my choices. The game was extremely refreshing to experience. I had to fully immerse myself in the world in order to succeed. I spend most of the time in the quests actually just completing subquests or gathering materials or cooking meat. The game slowed me down. I can take in the beauty of the game. I know it's not my favorite Monster Hunter experience, but has sprinkles of game mechanics that rewrite my perception of a Monster Hunter experience overall. It's making me appreciate everything that Monster Hunter, what it truly is, appreciating the features that were removed in favor of the new DPS boss fights. Look, a video game will always have room for improvements, absolutely, but not at the expense of losing features. Monster 2 DOS is a different experience. It's the original, pure Monster Hunter experience. I desired for this video to explain how the Monster Hunter experience has changed, and why, to some players, the more intimate experience with these games has disappeared. The number one reason being that they've clearly prioritized combat above everything else. I would believe players would argue that the most appealing part of Monster Hunter is the boss fights. Sure. The most unappealing part of Monster Hunter is when the game is tedious, which ended up being just about everything else in the old games, and even sometimes the boss fights themselves, like Plesioth. It's clear that Capcom wanted to make Monster Hunter experience more approachable, thus the streamlining and the focus on the DPS boss fights, because that's what people seem to like the most. Monster 2 DOS was attempting to expand on the more unappealing aspects of Monster Hunter and focus in on them for what they truly are, to focus on being a simulator. Every subsequent game has attempted to fix the more unappealing aspects, but unfortunately, they ended up just removing them through the streamlining. Capcom made mint chocolate ice cream. Capcom got scared when it just wasn't selling as well as they hoped. Capcom took the obvious route and they added more chocolate. People liked it, Capcom made money, and then Capcom forgot that it was meant to be a mint ice cream. Bottom line, I need to face the music. Capcom will never bring back the mint. Monster Hunter Portable is the norm now. My dream survival simulator Monster Hunter, it will never exist. And all I have that's close to this is this aggravatingly clunky PS2 game. And I guess Minecraft? There's Monster Hunter mods for Minecraft, right? I know as Western fans, we have very little influence over this Japanese franchise. This is all wishful thinking. If Monster Hunter continues to streamline and focus on DPS boss fights, all we can do is appreciate the old days and enjoy the new games for what they are. Remember that at least no matter what, the combat is still fun. Bryce did a great job on that. Really fun combat. Alright, that was my review. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Another little bonus, just for fun. Let's talk about my personal subjective desires for the next Monster Hunter title. These are entirely my own desires. They're not even expectations. And these are just for fun. They're my opinions, alright? Just for fun. So, for starters, the games need to return to a survival-focused standard overall. This is my opinion. The world needs to be more open, and we need to step away from the current quest village system. The player should be able to accept many quests at once, and leave the village to freely spend hours out in the field completing as many quests as they have in their list. We should be able to camp out in the wilderness and prepare all of our own supplies and just hunt monsters. Returning to the village should be a deliberate choice, not this automatic thing that happens after you finish a quest. If anything, the camp itself should be a traveling caravan, kind of like Monster Hunter 4, that already comes with a blacksmith. So like, everything you would ever need can just be accessed from the camp, and you don't always need to return to the village like every quest. Multiplayer can remain the way it's always been. You can still assemble in a gathering hall, the village, or town. You can still accept quests that way. Hunting needs to be viewed as a job. Money needs to be the only currency. Every single quest should come directly from an NPC or be related to the overall story. Monsters should be considered bounties again, not boss fights. Selling monster materials should earn way more money and should be normalized again. Small monsters need to be treated like large monsters. They should share materials. The end of low rank should be far more difficult. The game should treat the end of low rank as the end of the game, and high rank as extra content. We don't need tempered or hyper monster systems if we just made high rank way more aggressive. A superior tracking system should take over. The monsters should not just spawn in the same location every quest, but be a new experience every quest. Tracking monsters should be tied to the player's skill and knowledge, not an automatic tracking system. Monster interactions with the environment need to be more nuanced, or at least on par with the original animations in the ecology videos. The start of a hunt should be waiting for an Aptonoff to come to the river, and then wait for that Rathalos to swoop down. If a farm system must return, it should be like the Monster Hunter Portable games. It should require money and be viewed as a privilege, not free items. Keep gathering fast, but put more importance on it. Force the player to actually go out and gather honey again. It sounds tedious, but I assure you, the overall experience will be better. Balance the game knowing the player will have limited supplies. It is way more satisfying. I believe armor spheres need to be removed. The armor needs to have fixed defense or upgrade trees like weapons, like it was in DOS. Armor systems need to continue to focus on mixed sets. Individual pieces should be more difficult to acquire, but provide useful defensive skills. The game should be built to prioritize an armor that protects the player from a certain monster or environmental hazards, not to prioritize attack skills. Attack skills should just be removed. Combat should be focused on player skill, not player stats. And finally, overall, Monster Hunter should be more nuanced and involved experience. There is more that can be done with this game franchise beyond hunt large monsters over and over and over again. Thank you for watching, love you, and have a good night. Unless it's the morning, then have a good day. Play Monster Hunter, play Rise, or DOS. I don't do whatever the hell you want. Bye.